The Wind and the Void. Nightblade, Book 3. Written by Ryan Kirk. Narrated by Andrew Tell. Prologue. General Toro awoke to a cold, crisp morning, the third in a row. Despite the number of cycles he had seen, or perhaps because of them, Toro was fascinated by weather. In the Three Kingdoms, the farther south a traveler went, the warmer the weather became. But Toro was almost as far south as anyone in the Three Kingdoms had ever been, and though the autumn moon had just risen, already he woke to frost covering the ground in the mornings. It was as though the weather was broken. It felt as though the world was broken. Toro picked up his sword and tied it around his waist. He pulled the blade out, just a little, to ensure it still came smoothly out of the scabbard. He needn't have worried. Toro was a man who took care of the details, and his blade, a family heirloom hundreds of cycles old, still shone as though it had just come from the forge. Its presence comforted him. The world around him might shatter, but the sword would remain, solid and unyielding in a world of chaos. Toro was grateful even to wake up. Every morning fewer of them did. Every night they came. No matter how many torches were lit, they still found the shadows. They struck at random, and it was becoming commonplace to wake up to find your bunkmate with a slit across his throat or a stake through his heart. Toro had lost dozens of men, but the fear was an even greater threat. He took a deep breath, calming himself before the day ahead. Then he stepped out of his tent, disguising his shock at how cold it was outside. All around him, men moved with practiced discipline, purposeful in spite of their fear. Toro took a moment to look around, to recognize and remember the faces in the crowd. When he rejoined the great cycle, a day he feared was not long in coming, he would go knowing he was proud of the men with whom he served. The first was the best in the Southern Kingdom, and he was humbled to be their general. Toro began his morning routine. He went to a space in the camp dedicated to practice, an open area that messengers and soldiers avoided walking through. He was pleased to see the space was filled with men practicing. Although the area was crowded, the soldiers all made room for him. He drew a few stares, but by now his men were familiar with his routine. Toro drew his blade. He never practiced with wooden swords. He hadn't for many cycles. Steel was all that mattered. He made a few cuts, warming up his body and mentally checking his form. For as long as he could remember, he had been pursuing the perfect cut, the cut that would sing out as he struck. As his body, hardened by cycle after cycle of hard use, started to loosen, his movements and patterns became more intricate. His body remembered every cut, every step. The world around him shrank until it was just him and his sword, and then even that distinction became meaningless. When he finished, sweat was dripping from his body, but he didn't even notice. Sights and sounds slowly returned, and Toro was among his men once again. As sometimes happened, some of his men had stopped to watch. Toro still believed he was one of the better swords in the Southern Kingdom. He didn't have the speed or strength of the younger men, but his experience triumphed over their physical ability. His men were welcome to watch and learn. His practice complete, Toro went about the daily business of commanding an army. His first task was to the walls. The first was stationed at Fort Azuma, the fort built by Lord Akira at the southern end of the Three Sisters. Toro walked with his back straight and his head up. Especially in these trying times, his men needed to see their general confident. He was greeted by the same sight that had tormented him for the last few days. Out there, in the Azarian plains, beyond the reach of his strongest bow, was a sea of humanity. The Azarians had come with a strength no one in the Three Kingdoms had ever dreamed possible. There were tens of thousands of them, more than could be counted. Men, women, and children. The female Nightblade, Mariko, had been right. Azaria had brought their entire nation to make war on the Three Kingdoms. If it had just been the clans Toro and his men had gotten used to fighting, it would be different. Fort Azuma covered the entire pass, and during the summer without conflict, its walls had been strengthened and made taller. Though Toro's troops were outnumbered at least 10 to 1, they might have held. But the hunters changed everything. It was the hunters who came in the night, unseen, killing his men as though it were a game played among children, a lethal game of hide and seek. Toro had no answer to the hunters. He had doubled and tripled patrols and lit torches throughout the camp until he worried they would run out of fire before they ran out of food. His men still didn't sleep at night for fear their lives would be taken without a fight. The hunters would break his men long before the army beyond the walls would. Toro stared in frustration at the army, thinking that if he just studied them long enough, a solution would come to mind. But none ever did. As he watched, a youth ran from the camp towards the fort, bow in hand. The shouts of the warriors behind him carried to Toro's ears. He shook his head. They played this game every morning. The youth sprinted towards the fort, all alone on the plains that had seen so much death. Toro heard the grunts from the archers that held the wall, but their discipline held. He had ordered them not to shoot at these individual taunts unless their shot was sure. There was no need to waste arrows. The youth got close, closer than any who had come before. They are getting bolder, Toro thought to himself. Were they restless in the other camp? The youth aimed at Toro, as they always did. His uniform was different than the rest, and if they didn't know he was the general, they knew he was important. The arrow flew, a lone dark streak against a cloudless and uncaring blue sky. Toro watched the arrow, amazed again by the strength of the Azarian bows and archers. The youth was just inside the edge of his archer's range, and none of them felt confident enough to take the shot. The arrow dropped down, and Toro instinctively stepped back as the arrow clattered against the stone wall of the fort just below him. The boy had only missed by 2 paces. Toro shook his head, but waved nonetheless. He might as well torment them a bit while he could. They would come soon enough. Toro sat in his tent, going over his correspondence and reports for the day. When he was younger, he had thought the role of a general was to give inspiring speeches and lead men into battle. He had never guessed his greatest enemy would be day-to-day paperwork. The process didn't bring him joy, but it was his eye for detail that kept his army fed, supplied, and prepared to fight the enemy who threatened the Southern Kingdom. Toro ran his well-practiced hands through the papers, memorizing stockpile information, scouting reports of the surrounding area, and the number of troops and their distribution. He paused to consider the morale reports his commanders had given. The news wasn't surprising. The men were close to breaking, but Toro had no ideas for stopping the hunters. He didn't consider himself to be an excellent strategist. Lord Akira's 2 younger generals, Makoto and Mashiro, were much better. But Toro had a lifetime of experience and could put together disparate pieces of information to create a whole picture of what was happening to his army. Unfortunately, the conclusions he was reaching weren't pleasant. They were holding, but unless something happened soon, discipline would break. Since he had no grand ideas, he pushed the thoughts out of his mind. He saved his personal correspondence for last, both because he looked forward to it and because he feared it. Toro opened the unfamiliar letter first, not surprised when he saw it came from his new lord, Tanakh. He couldn't bring himself to put the honorific to Tanakh's name. It was Tanakh who had invaded the southern kingdom, killed thousands of soldiers, and left Toro alone in the south to defend against the much more dangerous enemy. The man didn't deserve the title of Lord. Toro read the letter once in disbelief, then a second time to ensure he hadn't been imagining the orders the first time. The letter ordered Toro to stand down and retreat from Fort Azuma. The first was to return up the pass, where they could meet with Tanakh's advisors to discuss the new command structure of Toro's army. Tanakh would send a small exploratory force down to the fort to meet with any Azarians and negotiate a lasting treaty. Toro swore to himself. Tanakh's decision was wrong, and he was placed again in a situation where he had to decide between his duty and the right action. The last time had been in the spring, when Lord Akira had left him here. At the time, Toro thought Akira was making a mistake, but that mistake was now the only thing standing between tens of thousands of Azarians and the Three Kingdoms. Or the Two Kingdoms, whatever they were calling it now. The only reason that Toro could imagine Tanakh would order the first back was because he didn't believe Toro's reports. He must think they were some part of a plot to give the newly merged kingdom into Akira's hands. But nothing could be further from the truth. If Tanakh doubted the sincerity of Toro's reports, Toro would delight in stationing his new lord on the wall. Then, when the arrows started to fall, he would at least do some good as a shield. He shook his head. Such thinking wasn't right. Personally, he might detest Tanakh, but Tanakh was his rightful lord, and as general of the first, he was sworn to obey. But if he did, the Three Kingdoms would lose their best defense. Tanakh's letter implied any possible aggression from the Azarians was due to the Three Kingdoms' encroachment on their land, but Toro didn't believe that argument for a moment. You didn't bring 50,000 troops to the field of battle to take over a single fort. You sent them to take over a new land. Toro pushed his frustrated thoughts aside. The decision could be made later. He glanced with eagerness at the second letter. It bore Lord Akira's seal and was written in his hand. Toro opened it carefully and found the contents to be much different than those of the first letter. Toro was surprised when he read it. Lord Akira was asking Toro to come home. Not the army, just Toro himself. He knew the next cycle would be a time of great struggle, and he wanted Toro by his side, helping him lead the fight against the Azarians. The letter ended on a personal note, discussing Akira's thoughts on his truce with Tanakh. Toro couldn't fault Akira for his decision to surrender. He wished there could have been a different outcome, but Toro wasn't sure he could have done better. Lord Akira had made the best decision possible, considering the circumstances. It wasn't ideal, but it gave them a chance to survive. Toro gently put the letter down, scratching his long beard, lost in thought. The offer was a tempting one. It meant life instead of death, and his heart, still in love with the idea of a long life, begged him to take his lord up on his offer. It was easy to rationalize. He was the most experienced general in both the Western and Southern Kingdoms. His experience was invaluable. But the wiser part of Toro believed the decision and the order were wrong. He was not the best strategist in the Southern Kingdom. If a military solution to the problem facing them existed, it wouldn't come from him, but from Makoto or Mashiro. Toro believed a general needed to lead his army. It was a part of him, a belief which shaped his life. To abandon his army in the time of its greatest need would be tantamount to spiritual suicide. Even if only a part of his men stayed to defend the fort from the invading army, Toro knew he would remain with the men who stayed and fought. He could not ask any man to lay down his life if he wasn't willing to himself. A single tear threatened to moisten Toro's cheek. He wiped it away dismissively, steeling himself for the reply he would have to make. Lord Akira's offer, generous as it was, had solidified his decision. He lit a new candle, knowing there would be much to say in this letter. It would be the last he wrote to his lord, a man he almost considered a son. He had much to say, and he knew his time was running out. He trusted Lord Akira would be satisfied with his decision. Toro got to work writing his final letter. He found that with his decision made, his soul was more at rest than it had been for some time. He wrote until his candle burned low, and just as night and darkness threatened to overtake his tent, he snuffed it out himself. Another morning came, and fewer of his men were alive to see it. After his daily stint on the wall, Toro went down to see the pyre lit for the men who had lost their lives in the night. Toro shook his head. Dying in your bedroll at night, sleeping, wasn't the way to leave this life. A soldier should die with a blade in his hand, an enemy snarling in his face. This type of warfare had no honor. Toro searched the faces around him as the pyre burned the bodies to ashes. The men were tense and afraid, more so than he had seen them before. He couldn't blame them. He felt the same way they did. It was one thing to know you might die in battle the next day, but it was quite another to know deep in your bones that if you went to sleep, there was a very real chance you might never wake up. It was the fear of the elderly instilled in the hearts of the young. As he watched, Toro knew his men only had a few days of discipline left in them. Unless their circumstances changed, it wouldn't be long before men tried to work their way back through the pass on their own. Here they died in their sleep, having accomplished nothing. The worst part was, Toro couldn't change their situation. Leading a sortie beyond the wall would be suicide and would accomplish nothing. But for now it was the only way to inflict damage on their foe. Toro cursed Nameless, the commander of the Azarians. With hunters, Nameless could pick off his men one by one until they broke. It took longer than a direct attack would have, but it risked far fewer lives. Taking Fort Azuma would be a bloody battle if Nameless used traditional means. That afternoon, a scout came back from the pass with news. Toro welcomed him into his tent. The scout was obviously cold, and icicles still hung from his uniform. "Sir, there is a blizzard in the pass. It seems likely to stay, sir." Toro considered the news. It was still early for the pass to have so much snow, but not unheard of. It opened up new possibilities for him. If the pass closed with snow early, no army would get through until spring, allowing the Three Kingdoms and Lord Akira more time to prepare a worthy defense after a summer full of war. Toro grinned maliciously. Nameless and his hunters might whittle down his men, but if they continued to take their time, they'd find their progress blocked by the pass itself. "How much longer do we have?" "Sir, we can't be sure, but our best guess is 3 days, maybe less. After that, no army will be getting through the pass." Toro paced his tent. The scout came from a unit that specialized in the Three Sisters. They were older men, experienced in the ways of the mountains and their volatile weather. He had to trust their judgment. If they said 3 days, 3 days was all they had. "Thank you. Make sure you get some warm food before heading back up." The scout looked grateful. "Yes, sir." Toro wandered the fort, studying his men carefully. They were determined and they were proud, but they had never faced anything like the hunters before. Many of his men who weren't on watch were sound asleep, grateful to sleep during the hours the sun shone overhead, protecting their slumber better than their fellow soldiers could at night. With a deep sigh, Toro made his decision. He called the commanders together. "Gentlemen, the last few days have been tough on us all. I hate to see our men taken in such a cowardly fashion. However, as you all know, events to the north have been dramatic, shifting the balance of power back in the land we call home. Our new lord, Tanakh, has ordered the first back up through the pass." Murmurs ran through the small group. Toro let them have a moment before he continued. "It is clear to me politics are interfering with the safety of our kingdom. You all have seen the threat the Azarians pose. Too many of us have already paid the ultimate price, but Tanakh would have us abandon our post, abandon the best defense of the Southern Kingdom." Toro's voice had risen, and there were murmurs of anger matching his own. Toro let them stew for a moment before continuing, his tone now subdued. "The fact is, gentlemen, as much as I wish it weren't so, Fort Azuma is lost. I don't question the bravery or the skill of our men, but these hunters are tearing us apart, and we are outnumbered 10-1 even without them. Even the most brilliant defense of this fort is doomed to fail. I won't mislead you. The good news is that the mountains themselves are on our side. As some of you may know, the pass is closing as we speak. Already the return will be treacherous. We only need to hold the enemy here for a day, maybe 2, and we will succeed in giving the Three Kingdoms and Lord Akira enough time to mount a true defense of the land. Gentlemen, serving as your general has been an honor. I couldn't ask for a stronger, more honorable group of men. My orders are to march the first back to the Southern Kingdom, and I will see those orders fulfilled. Tomorrow morning I will officially order everyone north." The murmurs became louder, and Toro knew he had them in the palm of his hand. "That being said, I will not be going with you. I intend to stay here on the walls and give my life to protect your retreat. I will be disobeying orders from my rightful lord, and the punishment for that is death. I expect there will be those who will dishonor my name, and that I accept. If anyone would like to desert with me and man these walls, I would be grateful. There may be a few too many Azarians for me to take on by myself." The joke was perfectly timed, causing a ripple of laughter to spread throughout the group. Toro would miss these men. "Men, make it clear to everyone. If you stay with me, you will be considered deserters. That way, no one who returns will see trouble on our account. I don't need many men, a few hundred should suffice. There is no dishonor in following orders and returning north. I expect each and every man of the first to show these Azarians what it means to be of the Southern Kingdom next spring. Make it clear that if they stay, there won't be any return. We will pay the price for desertion here in this fort. Are there any questions?" The men looked at one another, silent. It began with one of the men near the front, who bowed all the way to the ground, his forehead against the cold ground of the fort. One by one, the other men followed, until every man in the room had his face pressed against the earth. Toro looked out over them all, and a tear came to his eye. At the end of his life, he was proud. The Three Kingdoms were strong, filled with good, strong people like those before him. The Azarians would never win. Toro returned the gesture, holding his bow until every man had silently left the room. Toro watched as the last of his men marched up the pass. It had been an orderly march, if one of the most heartbreaking he had ever observed. With him stood over 300 men, those of the first who had elected to stay behind. There had been many partings, each of them made bittersweet by the knowledge they would never see each other again. Toro himself had wandered the camp almost all of yesterday, saying goodbye to each of the men. He was proud of them all, but none more than those who stayed behind. He turned and looked over the men, grouped in formation. He had already assigned a command structure to them. Each of them knew what to do and who to report to. They would fight to the last man. Some had stayed to protect families. Some had stayed for honor, some for revenge, and a few because they felt they had nothing left to lose. Toro thought he should say something powerful, but found he couldn't speak without breaking down. so he nodded once instead. His men understood, and they went to the walls. Toro had wondered how Nameless would react to so many of the first leaving the fort, and he didn't have long to wait to find out. That afternoon, Azarian clans lined up to march towards the fort. Toro stood with his men. His armor shone in the cold sunlight. Today he was no more than another soldier. Today they were all bowmen, all swordsmen. When the charge commenced, Toro looked from side to side and said, "To protect our brothers." The saying was passed up and down the line. The men drew their bowstrings back, and at Toro's command, the defense of Fort Azuma began. The Azarians had little battle discipline. That had always been true as long as Toro had fought them. But what they lacked in discipline, they made up in bravery. Once they began their charge, they broke formation, each running fearlessly into danger. Toro launched his first arrow, and it was joined by hundreds of others, dark streaks of death against the blue sky. Azarians fell, but it made no difference as they ran for the walls. Toro and his men launched another flight, just as an answering flight came up from the Azarian archers. While Toro's arrows came down on the Azarians in waves, their response was individual, each archer trying their luck against the soldiers of the first. Men started to fall to each side of Toro, but most were protected by the stone of the fort. When the first Azarians started climbing the walls, a handful of men laid down their bows and picked up rocks to drop on them. Stone was plentiful in the pass, and a well-dropped heavy stone could take out 2 or 3 climbers. It was only a matter of time before the sheer number of attackers overwhelmed Toro's troops. When climbers reached the top, they would throw down ropes to assist others. Toro dropped his bow and drew his sword, rushing from place to place on the wall, hacking at ropes and slicing at opponents. Dozens of his men stood behind him in the courtyard of the fort, sending arrows into the Azarians who made it over the top of the walls. Time blurred until it became meaningless. There was only the space in front of him. Twice, 3 times, the Azarians managed to get a foothold on the walls, and each time Toro's men surged forward in response. But each time there were fewer and fewer men to answer the calls for aid. Toro could hardly see the steel of his blade, it was covered in so much blood. Evening fell early in the valley, and at first Toro was confused when there was no one left to fight. When his wits returned, he heard the call of the horn, and saw the Azarians retreating for the evening. He was grateful. He had worried that Nameless knew the pass was closing. If he did, he would have never stopped, even if they had lost the light. Time was on Toro's side. If they could hold out for one more day, they would stop the Azarian invasion in its tracks. The price had been high. Of the 300 or so who had begun the fight, not even 100 remained. Toro looked with pleasure at the Azarian bodies on the plains, but even though Toro's men had acquitted themselves well, they had barely reduced the sheer number of warriors Nameless had at his disposal. That night the men were quiet around the fires. None of them would sleep that night. Between the combat and the fear of hunters, each would stay awake, maybe drifting off just for a moment or two before their partner next to them gently nudged them. Toro worried the hunters would come to finish the siege, but it seemed that Nameless was holding them back. Toro wasn't sure why, but he was grateful. That night they rested undisturbed around the fires. Their food was simple, most of the supplies having gone back with the first, but it was still the best Toro remembered tasting. He took in every breath, focusing only on the present moment. It was a beautiful moment, resting around a fire with the men he would die with tomorrow. They all knew, and all shared a look of calm acceptance. Above them, the stars were clear, and Toro could easily pick out the soldier and the princess, his favorite sets of stars. It was as much as he could have asked for on his final evening alive. The sun rose over the peaks the next morning, but the only way Toro could tell was that he could see the faint outline of his shadow on the ground. The snow had come down from the pass and was starting to collect here in the valley. There was only a little on the ground, but the sky was gray and lifeless above them. It was a dreary day to die. The snow must have warned Nameless that he had little time to get through the pass, because the entire mass of Azarians was on the move. Toro watched with a detached interest. It was an impressive feat to move so many so far. There had been little to say this morning. Each man covered a section of the wall, and it was their responsibility alone. No help would come today. No archers stood behind them in the courtyard, and there were no reserves to call for aid. Toro's only command had been to take as many Azarians to the Great Cycle with them as they could. They had to hold the fort as long as possible. If they could delay even until the sun was high in the sky, it should be enough time. Toro hoped his own men had made it through the pass. The snow that came down whipped across the fort. Shooting arrows would be a matter of luck today. But that was better for Toro than for his enemy. Toro had far more targets to hit. The Azarians approached. Again, Toro's men sent arrow after arrow into the crowd. They were to use as many as they could. Toro fired indiscriminately. The whole valley was a mass of humanity pushing against the fort. He fell into a rhythm. Knock, pull, release. Knock, pull, release. He didn't even aim, just sent arrows flying haphazardly against his enemy. There was almost no chance he could miss. Then he grabbed for an arrow, and none were left. He dropped his bow and drew his sword, just in time for the first Azarians to break over the wall. The fighting was close and bloody, but Toro moved like he never had before. There was no chance of surviving this battle, and when hope died, so did fear. Toro moved with a grace he had never before possessed, and Azarian after Azarian fell before his blade. Then he was shoved off the wall, falling into a pile of hay below. As he came to his senses, he realized the last of his men were being slaughtered, and that he was alone in a circle of Azarians. They made no move to strike at him, though. Something held them back, and Toro began to dread meeting the only person with that kind of power. Toro had listened to Mariko's tales of Nameless when she returned from Azaria, but he had never really believed her. She didn't seem like the type of person prone to exaggeration, but the description she gave of the commander of the Azarians was hard to believe. But when Toro saw Nameless in person, he realized she hadn't exaggerated, not at all. The man was huge, towering over Toro, a pillar of muscle and death. Even with his enormous size, he moved with grace and silence. Toro held his blade in front of him, but never had the action seemed so insignificant to him. "You are the commander of this fort?" Toro nodded. If he was going to die, it would be a legendary battle. He was pleased. He was a strong sword, and he was curious to see just how good these hunters were. "Your men fought well. We will bring stories of their courage to your land." Toro was surprised. He hadn't expected such magnanimity. "Thank you." "Come, let us end this. I will give you the warrior's death you deserve." Toro settled into his stance. He would show this Azarian the meaning of strength. If he could kill Nameless here, he could stop this invasion for good. Mariko had gotten a cut on him, so it couldn't be that hard. Toro moved in, leading with a perfect cut, the cut he had been searching for his entire life. Then Nameless moved, too fast for Toro to follow. For just a moment, everything was in motion, and then the world stilled again. Toro stood there, confused. Had he cut Nameless? His opponent had been right there in front of him. How had Nameless gotten behind him? Had he won? He tried to turn his head, but found he couldn't. The world started spinning as his head fell from his shoulders, a sensation his dying mind finally recognized. He wasn't afraid. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of death and had come to terms with it. He was only saddened he hadn't put up more of a fight. Nameless truly was a warrior of amazing strength. Closing his eyes, he smiled with pleasure at a life well lived, grateful to Nameless for giving him a warrior's death. His world went black, and at the last moment he felt the presence of all life, and then he rejoined the great cycle. Chapter 1. Ryu woke up from a dream where Akira was cutting at him with a sword. In the dream, Ryu felt like he was trying to move through water instead of air, every motion agonizingly slow. Darkness clouded the edge of his vision, creeping steadily inward. When his world went dark, he woke up, covered in sweat. He closed his eyes again and sighed. The sounds of the village came to his ears, and he took a moment to enjoy the reassuring sounds of daily routine. The village was small, a collection of a few huts in the woods. Ryu had stumbled upon it as he wandered west. He didn't even remember its name. He had offered to help an older couple with chores in exchange for a place to sleep for the night, and they had been delighted to oblige. They put him up in a room that had belonged to their son, off now fighting in the wars that ravaged the kingdom. The hut was filled with sadness. The couple smiled often enough and were very kind, but Ryu could tell there was an emptiness in the house. It was the same emptiness he sometimes felt in his own hut, many leagues away. It was the void left when a loved one leaves and does not return. The couple missed their son and had no idea if he was alive or dead. He was a member of the First, stationed down in the Three Sisters. Ryu didn't have the heart to tell them about the advancing Azarian invasion. He suspected everyone would learn of it soon enough, and he couldn't bear to bring more sadness to his hosts. Ryu didn't dare practice his forms in the village, and if he was being honest with himself, he didn't have the heart for it. It would only be a matter of time before riders came through the village with wanted posters bearing his face. He didn't need to help them by drawing attention to himself. Instead, he split wood for the couple, happy to help out in exchange for shelter. As he swung the axe, he fell into a meditative rhythm, and he shut out the world. It was past midday when he took his leave of the couple and followed the road again. Perhaps he should have been in more of a hurry, but he needed the time to think, and there was no better time than while on the road. Walking cleared his mind and allowed him to focus on the events of the past few moons. As he walked, he tried to use his sense, but it still refused to cooperate. It hadn't worked since his final fight with Renzo. His ankle still twinged a little when he walked on it, but it was nothing compared to the nakedness he felt as he walked through the woods without his sense. Ryu didn't know what had happened. All he knew was that when he awoke from the battle, he couldn't use his gift. He had tried meditating every day for a while, but when it hadn't created any results, he gradually stopped trying. Now he barely attempted it at all. The woods were beautiful. Reds, oranges, and yellows were everywhere. It was almost winter, and most of the leaves had fallen, but there were still enough in the trees that one would have to be blind not to appreciate their beauty. Even so, the woods seemed stark and barren to Ryu. He knew he was surrounded by life, but for the first time since he was a young child, he couldn't feel any of it. To his remaining senses, he might as well have been alone in the woods. He was returning to Mariko, but he wasn't sure what would happen when he did. He was a different man than when he had last seen her. Not only had he been to the island, but he had found incredible strength and then lost it. Would she still care for him if he wasn't strong enough? The last time he had sensed her, he could tell she, too, had changed. She was stronger, more dangerous than ever before. and he was broken. Ryu's thoughts raced round and round as he walked. He thought of Shigeru and Takako, those he had loved and lost. He thought of Mariko, the love he was afraid he had lost, and he thought of Renzo, Shika, Rei, Tenchi, and all the other Nightblades he had met on the island. There was so much conflict, so many dreams colliding with one another in the three kingdoms. All he wanted was to live in peace. He slept outdoors for the next 2 nights, not coming across any more villages. It was getting cold, but he had enough gear to sleep comfortably for a while yet. On the 3rd day, he crossed paths with a military unit marching to the east. Their uniforms were those of the Western Kingdom, the new conquerors of the Southern Kingdom. He stepped off the road, careful to hide his face from their eyes. They paid him no mind. His sword was hidden on his back, and he was dressed in poor traveling clothes. He would look to be no more than a peasant to them. In fact, he smiled grimly, he really was no more than a peasant anymore. Without the sense, he wasn't a Nightblade anymore. He found the idea didn't bother him as much as it once had. As they passed, Ryu had a strange thought. They couldn't call the land the Three Kingdoms anymore. There weren't 3 kingdoms. Would they call it the 2 Kingdoms? Ryu shook his head. It sounded wrong. And what would they call the land he was walking in? Would it be the Southern Kingdom or the Western Kingdom? He hadn't ever thought of it before, and wondered what was happening to the east, where the treaty was being signed. The sounds of the forest returned as the troops marched away, and Ryu pushed the thoughts out of his mind. It didn't really matter what they called the land. The only thing on his mind was Mariko. He needed to find her and figure out where they stood. The thought frightened him, but he had to know. He tightened the straps on his pack and kept moving forward. The forest gradually turned into plains as Ryu continued walking west. He knew if he kept going, he would eventually find woods again. As he expected, wanted posters started appearing, but they were few and far between, almost as though the effort to find him was half-hearted. He figured it was Akira's doing. He had to hunt Ryu to satisfy the terms of the treaty, but his heart wasn't in it. Ryu had taken the measure of Akira and found him to be an honorable man. Ryu had been on the road for almost a moon, and he guessed he was less than 100 leagues away from the hut. He hadn't been moving fast, fear of his upcoming encounter with Mariko slowing his steps. But the day would come soon. He couldn't put it off forever. Evening was falling, and a brisk wind told him it would be cold tonight. Ryu could already feel it in his bones. He looked for some small hollow or brush he could spend the night in. As evening fell, Ryu saw the flicker of a fire off in the distance. He walked towards it, hoping to share the warmth. When he approached, an older man invited him to join him by the fire. Ryu gratefully accepted. The old man was grizzled, long hair seeming to sprout at random from the tattered clothes that covered his body. He had the look of a man who had spent his life on the road, and Ryu suspected the old man didn't have a place he called home. Even so, the man was kind and generous, and Ryu immediately took to him. "Where are you traveling to, young man?" Ryu hid his half-lie behind a grin. "To the south and west." The old man shook his head. "Those are dangerous places. You would better be served to stay away." Ryu frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man eyed him warily. "You haven't heard?" Ryu shook his head. "There are all sorts of strange happenings west and south of here. Mind you, I've only heard rumors, but when one hears the same rumors from many different places, it's best to be wary. People say the roads aren't safe anymore, that travelers have gone missing. One of the crazier rumors I've heard is that an entire village disappeared." Ryu laughed. The old man had had him going for a moment. "Villages don't disappear, friend." "No, but people do.
The story I heard was from another traveler who had it from a village he'd been in. Apparently, a little girl in the village went to sleep one night, and when she woke up the next morning, the entire village was gone. Her parents, family, friends, everyone.
Ryu served them each a bowl of stew that had been cooking over the fire. After the days of cold traveling, the warm broth was a welcome relief. They ate in silence for a few moments, and Ryu tried to decide if the old man was pulling his leg, or if there was truth to the story. The old man spoke again.
Anyway, you can believe me if you want. I'm heading north, away from the rumors, but you have the look of a man who can take care of himself.
Ryu's eyes darted to the old man, suspicious. The old man chuckled to himself.
I may be old, but these eyes have seen more than yours, and they don't miss much. You move silently all the time, and that sword on your back isn't hidden from anyone who can use their 2 eyes.
Ryu hesitated for a moment, wondering if he had walked into some sort of trap. But the eyes of the old man sparkled with mirth, and Ryu accepted him at face value. He laughed softly and pulled his sword out and laid it by his side. "You've sharp eyes, old man. I've traveled for hundreds of leagues, and you're the first who has noticed." The old man smiled.
People. They walk around all the time, but they don't see anything, not really. If people would just slow down and open their eyes, they would see an entire world they didn't know existed.
Ryu nodded. He felt the same way about the scents. Maybe it was the fire, or maybe it was the obvious mirth of the old man, but Ryu found himself relaxing for the first time in over a moon. "So, tell me, old man, if you're so observant, what do you see?" The smile disappeared from the old man's face, and Ryu knew he was looking at the old man as he was, not as he often appeared to be. Ryu was reminded of Tenchi, cycles and cycles of wisdom hidden behind a grinning face.
You're a warrior. The way you move can mean nothing else, but it's really your eyes that give you away. They never stop. They're always looking in every direction. You've lived a life where you could be attacked at any moment. You've seen more than you should. There is little joy in your life at the moment, and if I had to guess, you are very lost."
Ryu gave a short grunt in response, and there was a moment of silence. The old man broke it.
"And now you must return the favor. What do you see?"
Ryu studied the man carefully. Despite his age, he moved with grace and strength. He handled a knife with dexterity beyond a commoner. Ryu gazed into his eyes, and he knew that at one time this man had been very dangerous, a soldier or a spy or an assassin. But not any longer. The old man had come to find peace with whatever was in his past, but he was always on the move, pursued by a history he'd rather forget. The old man saw Ryu's gaze, and although Ryu couldn't say how, he knew that the old man was aware Ryu had guessed his past. Ryu smiled. "I think you're an old man who probably sees too much." The old man laughed and served seconds of the stew. Ryu had always believed food tasted better with friends, and the stew was excellent. The next morning dawned cold, but Ryu awoke more refreshed than he had in ages. He and the old man had talked late into the night. The traveler was already up and packing. Ryu bowed to him as they left. "May your journey north be safe." The old man bowed in return.
"And may you find peace."
Ryu chuckled softly as the old man turned and walked away. He had decided the old man was right about the rumors, and he wondered what he was walking towards. Chapter 2. Akira waited for Makoto and Mashiro to finish reading the documents. In front of them sat the final draft of the treaty that would merge the Southern Kingdom with the Western Kingdom. It was a long document with hundreds of details that required close attention, and Akira fidgeted anxiously as he waited to hear what his two generals would think of it. More than ever, Akira missed both Toro and Ryu. The two of them couldn't be more different, but the one personality trait they shared was that they would tell him the truth, unconcerned about their status in his eyes. Makoto and Mashiro would get there someday, but they still thought of him as a lord first and a person second. When they had both put down the papers, Akira questioned them. "What do you think?" "You have negotiated generous terms," Makoto answered. Akira nodded. He agreed. Mashiro, the more outspoken of the two, jumped in. "I don't trust any of it. These terms are too good to be true. He's allowing you to sit as second in line to the kingdom, and he's allowing it to be named the Southern Kingdom. I fear your life will be over not long after the ink is dry." Makoto built on his friend's comments. "I agree. The terms seem too good for a victor to agree to. Is he worried about your people uprising against him?" Akira shook his head. "No, he isn't that foolish. It's the military he worries about. His forces outnumber ours, slightly, but with the order for the First to return, the balance of power will shift. The First is our strongest army, and once they return, I could force his armies out of the kingdom. He knows his terms need to be generous for the alliance to work." Mashiro stood up. "If that's the case, why don't we just use the First and crush his armies?" He paced angrily. Akira raised an eyebrow. "You know we can't do that. If Toro's reports are true, and I have no reason to doubt them, we can't waste a single man on a civil war." "It doesn't mean I need to like it. Your life will still be in danger." Akira shook his head again. "Maybe someday, but not soon. If I die too soon after the treaty is signed, it will be suspicious. He'll need to keep me alive for a while, at least, if he wants this alliance to last. We have time." Makoto spoke softly. "What do you think Toro will do?" It was Akira's turn to stand up and pace the room. "I don't know. I asked him to return, but I've received no reply. There is a blizzard in the pass, threatening to close it early. I fear we may not hear what happened to the First." There was commotion outside Akira's command tent. A messenger entered. "The First has emerged from the pass, my lord. News just came from riders, still covered in snow. They barely made it through." Akira's initial reaction was one of joy. It would be good to see Toro again. But the news also meant the pass would be undefended for the first time in over 60 cycles. Akira feared what the next spring would bring. The messenger continued. "There are letters from General Toro, my lord. He did not come through the pass with the First." Akira's heart sank. He grabbed the letters from the messenger and dismissed him. Makoto and Mashiro watched in silence as Akira read the letters. He scanned them quickly and threw them to the ground in anger. "That honorable fool!" Silence settled over the small group as Akira raged. It was Makoto, the soft-spoken giant, who asked, "What happened, my lord?" "He stayed behind with a few hundred soldiers to defend the retreat of the First. He knew they couldn't hold the fort against the Azarians. They were getting picked off one at a time by hunters. He sent the First back so they could better defend the kingdom, but he stayed behind, even though I asked him to return." No one spoke, honoring Toro's memory with silence. He had been one of their best, experienced, thoughtful, and strong. Akira straightened. "I'm going to need some time. Would you two ensure the First is given the same orders as the Second and the Third? Give them time to go home and rest. They will be needed soon enough. Find out how solid their command structure is. I'll want recommendations for commanders in front of me before the treaty is signed." The two generals bowed low and left the tent. Akira scooped up the letters he had thrown down and organized them neatly. He wanted to throw them in the flames, but they were the last words from a man who was as close to a friend as a lord could have. He couldn't bring himself to destroy them. Instead, he sat down and started reading them again, carefully, savoring every word. His eyes blurred with tears, but he wiped them away and kept reading. Akira sat in the tent next to his own, looking down at one of the most beautiful women he had ever met. Today all he could see was her back, but even so, he still found her lovely. Her back was bare except for the makeshift bandages covering the deep cut that went across her spine and the back of her arm. Not only had the cut paralyzed her, it had also gotten infected. Several times a day, Akira's best healers came in and cared for her, but still he wasn't sure if she would live or not. It had been almost a half moon since the attack, and still she clung tenuously to life. Ray stirred slightly, and Akira knew she was awake. "How do you feel?" Ray turned her head to look at him. She grimaced at the pain the movement caused, but she didn't cry out. She was strong, although her voice was soft. "I've had better days." Akira smiled despite himself. Even in incredible pain, she still kept her attitude. He was humbled. His thoughts were interrupted by her question. "How is your day going?" "I've had better days." She laughed and then sucked in her breath. "Oh, that hurts." Akira continued, trying to distract her. "Tomorrow, Tanakh and I sign the treaty to join our two kingdoms. I know it is the right thing to do, but still the action pains me. It is a bitter task to give up my throne." "Perhaps, but it is the only thing you can do to save your people." A silence settled in the room. Akira had come here with purpose, but now that the moment was at hand, he found himself nervous. "And what about you? What do you want to do next?" Ray sighed. "I'm not sure. I miss my home, but I can't think of any way to return, not without betraying the trust of my people. I fear I'll never hold a sword again. It's hard to admit, but I'll need to find a new path for my life." "Any ideas?" Ray moved her head just a little from side to side. "No. Being a warrior is all I've ever known. I've forgotten what other dreams I used to have." It was an impulse, but Akira blurted out, "You could stay here with me." Ray shook her head again. "A Nightblade and a lord? Our time has been enjoyable, and I wish it could be otherwise, but for the good of your kingdom we cannot continue. Also," she gave a mischievous grin, "I'm paralyzed from the waist down, and I don't think I'd be as much fun as I once was." Akira knew she was right. He didn't know what it was about Ray that made him take leave of his senses, but there was no way he could take a Nightblade as a consort, much less a wife. Akira stood up. "Rest well. I will come again before I leave to sign the treaty." Ray smiled. "Thank you for all your care." Akira left the tent, thoughts wandering through his head, wondering how it had come to be the woman he cared for was a fugitive in his own kingdom. The morning of the treaty signing dawned cold and cloudy. Akira worried that a storm was on the way. It was early for blizzards, but this season had all the marks of becoming one of the coldest in memory. Though it was only late fall, Akira was already bundled in layers of furs to keep himself warm. It had been a long time since he had felt so cold. As Akira rode towards the field where the treaty would be signed, he realized he felt empty inside, as though giving away his kingdom meant giving away a part of himself. When he saw Tanakh's banners snapping in the wind, a surge of hatred ran through him. This was the man who had ordered the slaughter of thousands of Akira's soldiers, the man who had broken a treaty that had protected the three kingdoms for over 1,000 cycles. As bitter as the task was, Akira had no choice but to move forward. The Azarians were a fearsome enemy, and he'd have to bury his hatred of Tanakh to defend the people of his kingdom. He dismounted easily from his horse and motioned his honor guard to remain behind. The tent had been placed in the middle of an empty field, and while both Tanakh and Akira had brought their personal troops with them, the soldiers stayed away. Rumors of the treaty signing had leaked out, and people were scattered around, watching the tent with curiosity. It was the first new treaty in over 1,000 cycles. Akira stepped into the tent alone and was immediately buffeted by the warmth of the space. Tanakh had lit a fire, and the tent was warm and cozy. Akira threw off his cloaks, grimacing in pain. When he tried to kill Ryu, the Nightblade had let him live, but his cuts had been deep. It still hurt to move. "Akira?" "Tanakh." A tense silence hung in the tent, thick enough to cut. The two of them didn't like each other, but this treaty was necessary. Akira moved further into the tent and sat next to Tanakh. "Do you find the terms for the treaty acceptable?" Tanakh nodded. "I do." "Shall we get this over with, then?" Tanakh shook his head. "You may remember that part of our agreement was that you would kill the Nightblade in your camp. I see you didn't bring any heads with you." Akira silently stripped off his shirt, displaying the giant red scars that crossed his chest. "I honored our word. I said I would try to kill him myself. However, he left me alive. He escaped, but my men are hunting him. I have done all I can to fulfill the terms of our agreement." Tanakh sat and stared at Akira for a long time. Akira had a hard time believing Tanakh would throw everything away over the fate of one Nightblade. His invasion forces had retreated, a ways at least, and with the first up from the pass, Akira had more troops than Tanakh in the kingdom. Time had passed and tables had turned. It was too late for Tanakh to order Akira around, and he knew it. "You wanted to die, didn't you?" Akira glanced up, surprised at the question. He met Tanakh's gaze. "I am the first lord to have lost his kingdom to invasion in the history of the Three Kingdoms. I am dishonored." Tanakh weighed Akira's answer. "And now?" "The Azarian threat needs to be dealt with. Once I am certain my people are safe and well-governed, I may once again seek the Great Cycle. But until then, I am needed." Tanakh considered Akira's response. After a few moments of silence, a smile broke out on his face, and he started laughing. "Akira, you are too much. I will say this for you. Your precious honor has been a great help to me." Tanakh looked over the treaties one last time. There were 3 copies, one for each kingdom and one for the monasteries. It was only a moment's work, but Tanakh signed them all and turned them over to Akira. Akira scanned them himself, making sure the key terms of the treaty were unchanged, but everything looked to be in place. He held the quill in his hand, hesitating at the last moment. Tanakh watched with interest, but Akira was glad he maintained his silence. If the other lord had said anything, it might have been too much for Akira. With a single stroke, he would give away his entire kingdom, the work of his entire life. But there was no other way. He signed the papers, and the Western Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom became one new kingdom. It would still be called the Southern Kingdom, but it wasn't the land he was born or raised in. It was something new, and hopefully stronger. Akira leaned away from the table. "It is done." Tanakh made as if to leave, but Akira gestured for him to stay. "What will be done about the Azarians?" Tanakh laughed. "They are your phantoms, Akira. I have sent spies down into Azaria, and they report the Azarians wanted nothing more than to reclaim the land south of the pass. Now that you have abandoned Fort Azuma, I expect hostilities will cease. My first act as Lord of the Southern Kingdom will be to ride south and present a formal treaty to the leader of the Azarians." Akira couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you serious? The Three Sisters is closed." "Yes, but my scouts report some of the game trails are still open. It's not enough for an army, but a small party can get through. I will take a small force, but I have already sent envoys, and they have been well received." Akira's head was spinning. "But they have hunters. And Nightblades are clearly running all over our land, so we have nothing to fear. I will establish a new peace that will last for lifetimes." Akira was trying to understand what Tanakh was saying. If he was speaking the truth, it cast doubt on over 60 cycles of combat between the Azarians and the Southern Kingdom. Had his people really been the aggressors? It wasn't logical. Toro had written of a host of Azarians almost beyond count. It was much more than was needed to take Fort Azuma, especially if there were hunters in the party. No, Akira was missing something, but he didn't know what it could be. "Tanakh, I think you are making a mistake. We need to gather our forces and prepare for the upcoming war. The Azarians will be here in the spring, and we need to be ready for them." "We don't need to be ready for them. I will treat with their leader, and when I come back, we will have peace." Akira saw he had no hope of changing Tanakh's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling there was something more he was missing. But without any idea what it was, he had no options. As much as it pained him to do so, his new role was to obey. "Very well. What would you have of me while you are away?" "Lead the hunt for the Nightblade. Work on the successful merger of the kingdoms. I want some of the goods from the Southern Kingdom sent into the Western Kingdom. If this is going to work, our people need to be united as one. I will station several of my closest advisors with you, and if there are any challenges, we can deal with them when I return." "As you will, my lord." Tanakh laughed. "Have no fear, Akira. This partnership will work." Chapter 3. Nameless stood on the walls of his newly won fort and looked south into Azaria. He wondered what those who had stood here before him had thought. Had they believed they were looking on a savage and barren land? Nameless had never known any land but Azaria. Even as they made plans to depart, he would always consider it home. There was a part of him that felt regret. Not for the blood he had spilled or the battle that would come, but regret that the only way he had found to save his people was to leave their homeland. He wished there was another way, but nothing occurred to him. The sun was high in the sky, but still the freezing winds blew down from the pass. The blizzard had been raging for days, and the scouts who braved the pass reported inhospitable conditions. Deep snow and avalanches had already cost Nameless some of his best scouts. In the plains below the fort, his people were camped, but daily it seemed they retreated against the onslaught of the cold. Nameless feared the coming winter. The demon kind were already ranging far and wide to bring in enough food for the camp, and he worried they wouldn't bring enough to maintain solidarity through the season. The people were not meant to stay in one place. But those decisions were for another day. Nameless had to give credit to the man who had commanded this fort. His men stood firm against the demon kind, refusing to break ranks, though many were killed night after night. Even more impressive, the commander had held the fort for over a full day with only a few hundred men. He had given his retreating army time to make it through the pass before it closed for the winter. Nameless could have killed them all that first day, but he had made the decision to leave the final assault of the fort to the clans, not the demon kind. His first strategy had been to send in the demon kind only. From what he knew of the people of the Three Kingdoms, he had expected the army to shatter after a few days of the attacks. He had hoped to take the fort without casualties to the clans. It had all gone to plan, except the army holding the fort had not broken as he had expected. There was a steel within the men he hadn't predicted. Then the news came that most of the army was retreating and the pass was closing. Nameless decided to let the clans have their chance at taking the fort. It meant a greater loss of life, but Nameless assumed with only a few hundred men guarding the walls, the clans would be able to take it easily. The people needed to remember this wasn't just about the demon kind. This was a victory for all of them. He had held his demon kind back, but again he had underestimated his opponents. They had held for a full day. It hadn't been much, but it had been enough. Now he was stuck on the wrong side of the three sisters as winter settled in. Nameless rolled his shoulders back and sighed. There was little to do about it now. Their only choice was to wait. With any luck, spring would come early. He had made a mistake, but the past couldn't be changed. Only this moment mattered. He had sent 20 pairs of demon kind through the southern kingdom over the game trails that were just barely open. Their orders were specific. They were to spread fear and terror throughout the southern kingdom. Nameless might not be able to lead the people across the pass this winter, but when they marched in the spring, he expected to find a land torn apart by fear. The army had held, but the people of the three kingdoms never would. They were too weak. Nameless smiled. He was delayed, but he wouldn't fail his people. Nameless was out in the fields watching some of the clan's train when a messenger came to find him. The messenger was one of his demon kind, and from the snow still on his shoulders, Nameless assumed he'd come from the mountains. "Yes?" "An envoy comes from the three kingdoms. It is a small group, 10 strong. They are taking one of the game trails through the mountains we have been watching." "Is it him?" The messenger shook his head. "We do not recognize any of the riders, and none of them are gifted. At least one is richly dressed, though." Nameless considered this for a moment. "How long until they are in sight of the people?" The messenger thought about the question. "They are making slow progress. The trail is hard. Perhaps 2 or 3 days. More if the trail worsens." Nameless debated what to do. His gut warned him against letting them see the mass of forces arrayed against them. If an enemy envoy was to reach the clans, it might spread further dissension among the ranks. He was already concerned about several clans after the escape of the female Nightblade. Best to meet them in the mountains. "Can you guide me there?" The messenger nodded, almost as though he was offended Nameless would ask the question. "We will leave immediately. Find 2 others to come who have strong bows. I will meet you here." It took little time for them to gather. Nameless approved of the other demon kind who had volunteered. He had known both for many cycles, and their skill with a bow was excellent. Their quivers were full, and their clothes were warm. Without a word, they took off for the mountains. The trail was hard, and it wasn't long before they abandoned their horses. Azarians prided themselves on their horsemanship, but they were riders of the plains, not of the mountains. Demon kind could move faster on foot over the narrow trails that wound through the heights. Nameless set the pace, a steady march that ate up the distance between him and the envoy. His side still ached from where the accursed woman had gotten the best of him, but he relished the pain. It was a reminder that for a moment he had let down his guard. He had beaten her, but not by enough. Never again would he give anyone the chance to hurt him. They ran through the day and night until they came to a place where they could see the trail for hundreds of paces. Nameless pointed to an outcropping of rock about 100 paces ahead of him and about 30 paces above the trail. He spoke to the archers. "Go there. If needed, unleash your arrows. Stay hidden." The archers nodded and trudged up the mountainside towards the rocks. Nameless saw their tracks and hoped the blowing snow would hide them by the time the envoy arrived. He turned to the original messenger. "Go further ahead and find a place to hide. You will be our last line of defense. If it turns to violence, ensure none of them find their way back home." The messenger nodded and ran ahead. Nameless squatted in the snow and waited. If the messenger's estimate of the envoy's speed was accurate, he wouldn't have more than a half a day to wait. They came as promised, but when Nameless counted, they were only 9. His first suspicion was a trap, but when he studied their careful approach, he took a different guess. One had fallen on the trail. It was little surprise. The game trails existed, but they were dangerous, and for a group of 10, it was surprising only one had fallen. The envoy halted in front of him, and Nameless took their measure. The one richly dressed was the one in charge, but his eyes were full of fear. The man tried to mask it, but Nameless could smell it on him. The other 8 were warriors, and they handled their mounts well enough, but Nameless agreed with his messenger. None were gifted, and none would be able to match him. The richly dressed man spoke. "My name is Lord Tanakh, Lord of the Southern Kingdom. Who are you, and why do you stand in our way?" Nameless stared curiously at Tanakh. The name he recognized, but the title was new. His sources had told him that Tanakh was the Lord of the Western Kingdom. He must have defeated the Southern Kingdom in combat. Nameless's silence made Tanakh uncomfortable, so he let it linger for a few moments longer than necessary. "I have no name, as is true of all my kind. However, I am the leader of the people, and I have come to hear what you would say." Tanakh looked around as though he disbelieved what Nameless was saying. They were in the middle of nowhere, a mountain pass used more by goats than by humans. It was not what the Lord had expected. "Are you going to escort me to your people? I come bearing terms of our truce." Nameless stifled a grin. "We can treat here. I am the only one who must hear what you have to say." Tanakh looked doubtful, and Nameless saw in the Lord's face that he considered the Azarians to be less than those of the 3 kingdoms. He considered the people savages. Nameless would delight in proving him wrong. Nameless glanced at the men on horseback again. "Where is the one we dealt with before? The Nightblade, Renzo." Tanakh shook his head. "He is dead, killed by another Nightblade in battle." Nameless was surprised. He had met Renzo once, and the man had been strong. For him to be defeated indicated there was greater power in the 3 kingdoms than he guessed. It must have been the boy. There was no one else capable. He pushed the thoughts aside. Right now all that mattered was dealing with Tanakh. "What are the terms of your truce?" "As you discussed with Renzo, all the land south of the 3 Sisters is yours. The pass will be considered a no-man's zone. You will never have to deal with our attacks again, but we never have to deal with yours either." Nameless laughed. It was the deal he had discussed with Renzo. Nameless would distract the armies of the Southern Kingdom, pinning them down in the fort while Tanakh and Renzo swept through the Southern Kingdom. Unfortunately, it had taken Nameless longer than he expected to bring the clans in line, and his invasion hadn't begun until autumn. Fortunately, it had all worked out. He had promised Renzo peace, but what he really wanted was a land torn apart by war. Renzo had always seemed suspicious, but it seemed this lord had fully believed in their agreement. Tanakh frowned. "What's so funny?" Nameless shook his head. "I will never treat with one as pathetic as you." Tanakh wasn't used to such treatment, and although Nameless saw the fear flash in his eyes, he acted as though he was courageous. "That's a bold statement when 1 stands against 9. Nameless smiled. He felt the power flow into his limbs. Without a word, he drew his blade and darted among the horses. Every soldier seemed to be moving through water, unable to respond to his attack quickly enough. He intentionally left Tanakh and a guard alive, but he wasn't quite fast enough to get through the entire line. The soldier who had brought up the rear of the envoy had turned his horse when they had stopped, protecting their flank. As soon as Nameless attacked, he spurred his horse forward, escaping Nameless's blade. Nameless threw out his energy, a signal to his demon kind hidden up the trail. They rose in unison, sending an arrow into each man and beast. Nameless cleaned his dark blade and turned towards Tanakh. "Is my answer enough?" Tanakh looked terrified, and Nameless could see the dark stain spreading down his leg. The man was a coward. Nameless looked to the other soldier, frightened but standing firm. "Can you deliver a message?" The soldier nodded, unable to speak. "Good." Nameless leapt easily onto the back of Tanakh's horse. The Lord hadn't even drawn his sword. Before man or beast could react, Nameless's blade sang one more time, and he caught Tanakh's falling head with his other hand. He leapt down to the ground, landing softly in the snow. He took the head to the soldier and put it in his hands. "Tell your people we are coming." Chapter 4. Mariko's sword cut through a snowflake as she finished her practice. The sword moved as an extension of her body. Her mind and sword worked as one. She cut and turned and cut again, each move perfectly controlled. With a smooth motion, she sheathed the sword and took a deep breath. Something had changed inside her during her time in Azaria. It was more than just gaining the ability to snap, as Ryu called it. The ability was nice, but as Mariko breathed in the crisp winter air, her body felt more alive than it ever had been, tingling with energy. She felt like she could run for days and still have the strength to fight. Down in Azaria, she had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Finished with her practice, Mariko wandered through the woods. She had missed them dearly, but hadn't realized how much until she returned to them. It was quiet, the daily sounds muffled by the fresh powdery snow covering everything. The forest swallowed up even the sound of her footsteps, but she felt no hesitation wandering among old woods. They were places the people of the Three Kingdoms avoided, but to Mariko, visiting the old woods was like visiting a best friend. She felt refreshed and calm. As often happened on her wanderings, her thoughts turned to Ryu. It seemed hard to believe, but it had been over half a cycle since she had seen him last. She wondered if he had found the island, and if he had, what he had found there. But more than that, she wondered if he would return to her. She hadn't waited for him, and she didn't know how he would react. For all his strength, she still found him fragile in a way difficult to describe. His sword was strong, but his mind wasn't. Despite his age and experiences, Mariko felt like Ryu still had to grow up. She was making plans to leave the Three Kingdoms. There were trading ships that left from Highgate in the Northern Kingdom. If she could find her way onto one of those, they could take her to a new land, a land where she could put all the pain of her previous life behind her. The Three Kingdoms had fallen into war, and Mariko knew better than most that the challenges were just beginning. By next summer, she was sure the entire land would be burning. She didn't owe the Three Kingdoms anything, and she didn't plan to be around to watch it burn. The question she kept turning over in her mind was whether or not Ryu would join her. He felt an attachment to the land and people that Mariko didn't. She wanted him at her side, but she feared he wouldn't want to run, that he would want to stay and fight in the middle of it all. She shook her head, trying to clear it of unpleasant thoughts. The woods were too peaceful for such nightmares. She imagined the trees, here for time untold. They had seen so much more. At the end of time, all her problems were small and meaningless compared to the scope of the world. The thought brought her comfort as she wandered through the woods, her hand brushing lightly against the bark of the trees. Although winter was just beginning, there was already a fair covering of snow on the ground. Winter had come early to the Southern Kingdom. Mariko wondered if it was some sort of omen for the coming storm. But her needs were more immediate. She and Ryu had been gone all summer, and in their absence, most of their harvest had been destroyed. Mariko tended their garden as best she could upon her return, but the damage had already been done. If she was going to survive the winter in comfort, she was going to need more food, and she was worried she might not be able to get it. She hadn't seen a soul since leaving the Three Sisters, and she had no idea what was happening in the rest of the Three Kingdoms. Had the Azarians invaded? Were the people of the Three Kingdoms preparing for war? If the whole land was prepared for invasion, it would be impossible to procure food. Regardless, she had to try. She and Ryu had plenty of money, as their needs were simple, and Shigeru had left a fair amount of gold behind when he died. Even if food was expensive, she should be able to get what she needed, if it was being sold at all. If nothing else, she needed to get out to learn what was happening in the world. Knowledge was safety. She packed up their medicine kit. The nearest village was a 2 days' walk away, but she was known there as a wandering healer. It brought in some money while providing a backstory for a woman who came into town so infrequently. The walk was cool but pleasant. Mariko had dressed in simple garb so she wouldn't be recognized, her sword hidden on her back, covered by the bulky medicine cabinet. It would be awkward to draw, but she kept her sense alive and expanded. She didn't worry about anyone sneaking up on her. She arrived at the village without incident, but when she arrived, she thought for a moment that the village had been abandoned. It was small, about 60 people in all, mostly farmers. But though the village was small, it had always been lively. Most days people were outside working or talking with neighbors. People rarely stayed in. It wasn't their way. When the village first came into view, Mariko couldn't see a single person. She worried for a moment, but when she extended her sense in the direction of the village, she could sense the warm glow of life. Mariko frowned. It was cold, but not so cold people would stay inside. She didn't sense any danger, so she came down among the houses. It was an eerie experience, standing in the middle of the village without anyone to greet her. She and Ryu came through infrequently, but when they did, they had always been welcomed warmly. Today, doors and windows were shut against the outside, and no one even knew she was there. Mariko wandered over to the house of the village matriarch. She had seen almost 60 cycles, and her house was the center of all activity. Mariko knocked softly against the door. "Hello?" She didn't hear anything, but she could sense the fear and panic in the house. She knocked softly again, and finally she sensed the old woman was coming towards the door. The door opened, just a crack, and Mariko saw a small fire burning in the center of the hut. When the old woman saw who it was, there was a commotion inside, and the door opened all the way. Mariko was ushered into the house quickly, and the door was shut behind her. "What are you doing outside?" Mariko wasn't sure what her best answer was. Something was happening, and if she was a wandering healer, she would be aware of it. She needed a story, but her mind didn't seem to work fast enough. "I've been wandering for some time. I thought it was time to come to the village and see how you all were doing." The old woman eyed her with a hint of suspicion. Mariko was surprised. They had always received such a warm welcome. What could be happening to make them act like this? "I am sorry," said Mariko. "I have been in the deep woods for over a moon, caring for an old man who behaves like a hermit. I have had no news in that time. What has happened? Why are you all inside, huddled together with so much fear?" The cloak of suspicion the old woman wore dropped in a moment. Despite her fear, she was still the matriarch of the village, and she believed in kindness and hospitality. "I am sorry too, my dear, but these are dangerous times, and no one travels the roads." Mariko frowned. She had only been back in the Three Kingdoms for about 2 moons. How much had happened in that time to instill such fear in the people? What do you mean? What has happened? The old woman looked around as though the very mention of the danger might bring it into her household. There are strange rumors going about. All we hear from everyone on the road is how entire villages are disappearing. The people in them vanish. Families have lost fathers, sons, mothers, and daughters. Other travelers speak of horrible deeds, of villages massacred with no one left alive. They say that villages are red from the blood that has been spilled. I do not know what to believe, but we have heard the rumors enough times to know something is wrong. Mariko shook her head. If what the old woman was saying was true, something was happening in the Southern Kingdom, something besides an invasion. Her mind raced, but couldn't come up with an explanation for the rumors. How long have these rumors been spreading? The old woman shrugged. It has been a moon, maybe a moon and a half, since we heard the first rumor. At first I dismissed it as the ravings of a lone traveler, but more and more we've heard stories from different sources, and now there are no travelers in this area. Whatever is happening sounds as though it started further to the south and is working its way north. We have thought about leaving the village and heading to New Haven, but it is hard to leave the land, and harder still to carry the supplies we would need for winter. The old woman had said her piece, and a silence settled over the room. Mariko pondered what the old woman had said, but couldn't decide what was happening. It had to be related to the Azarians, but she wasn't sure how. Regardless, it wasn't why she had come. I'm sorry to hear such ill tidings, but I must be on the road again by tomorrow. Is there anyone who needs healing? The old woman nodded. A fever has taken one of the older women, and one of our boys has broken a leg. Your services would be appreciated. Mariko's presence in the village drew people from their homes, if only for a little bit. Children, tired of being cooped up in their houses, ran around the village freely, although Mariko could see their mothers kept a watchful eye on them to ensure they didn't leave the village, not even to play in the adjoining fields. Mariko did what she could for the people of the village. The older woman's fever concerned her the most. They had already been doing everything they could to break the fever. Mariko gave them some herbs she hoped would help, but as she examined the old woman, she feared she had come too late and that the old woman would rejoin the great cycle soon. The young boy was a different matter. The break was almost brand new, and Mariko was able to set the bone and splint it. Her work with the young man made her think of her time with the Azarians. In their culture, such a break could have been fatal. But here the boy would live to hopefully see many more days. When she was done, Mariko went back to the old woman and bartered for some food. She wasn't able to get as much as she would have liked, but it was enough for now, and she could see the fear in the eyes of everyone she met. She couldn't bring herself to push for more. They begged her to stay. In their eyes, being on the road was tantamount to suicide, but she was able to convince them that as a healer she was honor-bound to stay on the road and provide what help she could. It was clear they didn't agree, but they couldn't force her, and as the sun set on that day, Mariko left the village with a heavy heart. Mariko was loath to admit it, but her visit to the village had made her nervous. There was no doubt in her mind something was happening in the Southern Kingdom, and if she had to guess, the Azarian hunters had something to do with it. They were the only warriors she knew of with the strength to eliminate entire villages and disappear without a trace. She thought about General Toro. Had something horrible happened down in the pass? She felt a twinge of guilt. Perhaps she should have stayed there. Mariko shook her head. If the three sisters had fallen, there was little she could have done to prevent it. She was strong, but there were far more hunters than she could handle, and if the general had died defending the pass, she would have died there with him. She had made the right decision. Nevertheless, her own safety was at stake. She had told Ryu in her letter she would stay at the hut until spring came. At the time, she had believed it would be safe to stay in the Southern Kingdom until then, but if the hunters were active in the Southern Kingdom, there wouldn't be any safety to be found. Mariko was torn between her desire to leave the problems of the three kingdoms behind her and her desire to wait for Ryu, to see what he would decide. Unable to choose, she chose a middle path, deciding to scout more regularly to the south of the hut. The rumors had placed the hunters, if Mariko was right, further to the south. If she was going to find them, that was the direction to search. As the moon grew brighter in the sky, Mariko's daily pattern changed. Instead of spending her time in the old woods surrounding the hut, she wandered further south. There were 2 villages in that general direction, both about 4 days' walk from her hut. She traveled to both of them, scouting to make sure they were safe. She did not enter the villages, electing instead to remain hidden from sight. Both villages were quiet, sealed in like the one she had visited earlier, but they were otherwise unharmed. Mariko was grateful. If the rumors were true, this meant the hunters were not yet nearby. Mariko no longer traveled the roads. Instead, she followed game trails that kept the road in view or in range of her sense. In this way, she was able to keep track not just of the villages, but of the travelers who roamed from village to village in these dangerous times. It was on one of these journeys that Mariko encountered a pair of hunters. She sensed them long before she was in sight of them. She pushed down the fear that threatened to take hold of her. If there was anyone in the world who was still a danger to her, it would be a hunter. But she had faced them before, and they had joined the Great Cycle while she was still here, pursuing those who thought themselves invincible. They were dangerous, but so was she. The afternoon sun was burning low when she sensed them, and she crept quietly towards them, making sure her own presence was completely suppressed. There was no way they would know she was watching them. She hid deep in the brush, keeping as much distance as possible between her and them. More than once she had been discovered by smell, and she had no intention of repeating that mistake. Mariko squinted when she saw the hunters. The 2 of them were unmistakable in their Azarian garb. Their tall stature and easy grace made them easy to pick out. But they were meeting with someone who looked to be from the Three Kingdoms. Mariko pushed her fear down. The hunters were in front of her, and it was she who was hunting them. They no longer had any power over her. She crept closer, trying to learn more. The person they were talking to didn't seem to fear them, and in fact seemed to be on equal terms with them. She felt like she was on the verge of solving a puzzle, the answer nibbling away at the edges of her mind, but she couldn't figure out why. The man they were talking to was unremarkable as far as Mariko could see. He was of nondescript height, and his clothes didn't mark him as rich. His features were covered by a hood, and Mariko didn't dare get close enough to see if she recognized him. She sat there as the hunters and the man conversed, debating what to do. Her instinct was to kill all 3 of them and be done with it, but it was full daylight, and she was most dangerous in the night when the shadows were her friends. When it hit Mariko, she couldn't believe she hadn't noticed it before. The hunters were so strong that all her attention had been focused on them, but there was another person using the sense in the area. And when Mariko first noticed it, she realized it was coming from the 3rd man. The realization rocked her back on her feet, and she retreated to the shadows of the bushes and trees. If the hunters were meeting with someone who possessed the sense, it had to mean they were meeting with a monk. The more Mariko focused her sense on the 3rd person, the more convinced she became. The sense manifested differently in different people, but all monks had the same training, using the sense in a very particular way. Mariko had grown up around such abilities, and now that she was focused, there was no doubt the man was a monk. Mariko's mind raced through the possibilities. She tried to remember every memory she had of the monasteries. Never in her knowledge had a hunter visited, and she had never had any indication they were united in purpose. But she had been young. Perhaps she had missed the signs in the ignorance of her youth. Memories ran through her mind, but she couldn't come up with anything to make her believe the monasteries would work with the hunters. The evidence, however, was right in front of her. The consequences frightened her. The monks were weak compared to Nightblades, but they were still fearsome opponents, and the common citizens of the three kingdoms held them in reverence. If the monks cooperated with the hunters, the three kingdoms would fall. There wasn't a doubt in her mind. The urge to jump out and strike was stronger than ever. Mariko had managed to move past the harms done to her while she was in the monastery, but she had never managed to forgive. The monks were as good as dead to her, but reason held her back. She was strong, but fighting three powerful opponents in the daylight was courting disaster. She would follow them until nightfall. Then she would strike and take their lives. The hunters and the monks spoke for some time. Mariko waited patiently. Every moment they tarried was a moment the sun fell closer to the horizon, and the closer their deaths came. She hunted the hunters, and she was in no rush. Mariko was disappointed when the hunters and the monks separated. She had hoped they would stay together so she could kill them all together. Unfortunately, their plans didn't coincide with hers. The monk turned to take the path south, and the hunters turned to take the path north. Mariko was faced with a decision. She couldn't follow both of them. She suspected the hunters would be on the way to destroy another village, but the monk seemed more important. He had been speaking with the hunters for some time, and they had treated each other as equals. The monk was carrying a bag, and if the bag held important information, it might be worth the price of several villages. Mariko's hesitation lasted only a moment. She wanted to pursue the hunters, but alone, the monk was an easy target. She would kill him and track down the two hunters again. If she was fast, it wouldn't be difficult at all. Mariko raced after the monk, staying well off the road. She wanted to get ahead of him and ambush him. She would have his bag and be away before the hunters got too far. Eventually, Mariko cut towards the road. She found a tree that was easy to climb and stood near the path. She clambered up the branches, finding a perch about 5 paces above the trail. From her branch, she would see the monk coming and surprise him. She wasn't well hidden, but no one ever looked up. When the monk came into view, she thought she saw him slow down for a moment, and she was instantly suspicious. There wasn't any way he should be able to sense her, but if the past cycle had taught her anything, it was that she still had a lot to learn about what the sense could do. But the monk kept walking, and her nerves were calmed. The monk stopped a few paces ahead of where she sat. He looked up, and Mariko almost fell off her perch. There was no way it could be true, but the evidence was right there in front of her. The face that looked at her was smiling, a ghost from the past, a smile that held no warmth. "Hello, Mariko. Come on down." His name was Tomatsu, and Mariko had thought he died many cycles ago. She dropped from her tree, landing softly on the path in front of him. They stood a few paces apart. They were safe from each other for now, but were within a step or two of striking distance. Tomatsu had been one of the first people she had met when she had been taken to Perseverance. He was a cycle or two older than her, but she had been young and impressionable, and she had pinned all her hopes on him. He had cared for her after she'd been beaten, but she soon realized the monastery had him, heart and soul. When Ryu had rescued her from the monastery, She had assumed Tomatsu had been killed with the other monks. For a moment, she was glad her assumption was wrong. Even though Tomatsu had pledged himself fully to the monastery, he had always been kind to her, even when their viewpoints had been so obviously different. Even after Orochi trained her, Tomatsu still kept in touch. But as she studied his face, she knew something in him had changed. "Hello, Tomatsu," she said. "It seems the Great Cycle has brought us together again. It has been a long time." She nodded. "It has. I am glad to see you." Tomatsu barked out a harsh laugh. "You mean after you betrayed our monastery and the Nightblade came and killed most of us?" Mariko moved to speak, but Tomatsu held up his hand. "No, there is no point in this conversation. This only ends one way." Mariko interrupted him. "How can you be so blind? You saw what the abbot did. How can you believe in a system that teaches such violence is justified?" Tomatsu drew his sword. It didn't waver at all as he pointed it at Mariko. She understood, as she watched the point of his sword, how much rage he had carried for all this time. "I don't know how you can doubt the teachings of the Great Cycle." Tomatsu spat in her direction. "Even you have to see that the cycle is coming to a close. What are the odds of you and me coming together again, like this? The abbot's teachings may have been hard, but it was the Nightblade who established my faith. For the first time, I saw how dangerous the Nightblades were, and I dedicated my life to killing them all. Those who don't believe must die." Mariko opened her mouth to argue, but Tomatsu dashed forward, his blade eager for blood. Mariko dove out of the way and drew her sword, but she hesitated. This was Tomatsu, perhaps the first friend she had ever had in the world beyond her family. But as he came in again, there was nothing of the kind boy she had once known. He had been broken by grief. Mariko's sorrow was replaced by anger, and she attacked. Tomatsu had no chance against her. He was well-trained and driven, but she was much stronger than him. In 2 passes, he fell to her blade, his dying eyes filled with hate. Mariko observed his passing into the Great Cycle. He deserved that much, at least. When he was gone, she closed his eyes and grabbed his bag. It was full of papers, a small fortune's worth. She stood for a moment over her first friend, and then the world came rushing back to her. There were still 2 hunters she needed to kill. The sun was setting, but if she hurried, she could get to them before they caused any more destruction. Despite her repeated checks, Mariko did not find any trace of the hunters besides the tracks they left, and even those were few and far between. Mariko began to wonder if they were moving faster than she had anticipated. Were they trying to reach the village during the day? If so, she didn't have a chance of catching them. Mariko fought her urge to sprint after the hunters. It was possible they were moving much faster than she expected, but it was just as likely they were playing another game altogether. She didn't know what skills the hunters might possess, and there was certainly a possibility she was not the only person capable of hiding her presence from those with the sense. She had to be cautious, otherwise they could sneak up on her as easily as she could sneak up on them. By the time the sun set, Mariko had not stopped for more than a few moments the entire afternoon and early evening. She was worried. If the hunters could maintain this sort of pace and still destroy a village without leaving a clue, they had physical capabilities far beyond her own. A shadow of doubt in her own abilities crossed her mind. Perhaps the caves had just been a fluke. Perhaps instead of all the skill she thought she possessed, she had just gotten lucky. Mariko shoved the thoughts aside and focused on the present moment. Whatever doubts she had, she knew she would not be able to live with herself if she allowed a village to be destroyed when she could do something about it. As soon as the thought came to her, she stopped dead in her tracks. It was the type of thought she would have expected from Ryu, a selflessness which would put her in danger. He was starting to rub off on her. Mariko reached the outskirts of the village just as the sun was setting. At first glance, everything in the village seemed normal. She dared not enter and attract the attention of the hunters if they were nearby. Thinking quickly, she suppressed her presence and hid in some tall grass a few hundred paces away from the village edge. From her vantage point, she could see the majority of the village and sense all of it clearly. If the hunters were here, and if they attacked, she would be ready. She settled down into a comfortable position to wait. The moon was high in the sky, and Mariko wasn't sure she had made the right decision. What if her tracking skills had misled her? What if the hunters had gone another way? Mariko was doubting herself, and after the encounter with Tomatsu, she was more shaken up than she cared to admit. Only her anger kept her on her feet. If the hunters weren't here, she would have to sleep for at least a day to be able to continue the hunt. As the evening wore on, it became harder and harder to focus her sense on everything happening around her. Mariko allowed her sense to wander through the village and its surroundings, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Everything seemed quiet, a peaceful night and a sleepy village. The sound of crickets in the air was relaxing. When Mariko awoke, she thought it was already morning. She blinked her eyes and shook her head and realized she was wrong. It wasn't morning, but the village below her was burning, throwing off enough light and heat to make her think the sun had come up. She cursed herself and bolted to her feet, but stopped before she ran into the village. She needed to think before she acted. Taking a deep, calming breath, Mariko extended her sense. She was late, but she wasn't too late. She could sense the two hunters, the center of everyone's attention. Marking them, she moved quickly. Below her, several of the buildings were aflame, and there were shouts and screams from the villagers who were trapped inside their houses. Mariko debated whether to save them or to go after the hunters first. Her initial instinct was to go after the hunters. If she could kill them fast enough, she could then release the villagers without fear of them being attacked once again. But as she passed the first house, she couldn't do it. The screams and cries coming from within were too much for her to handle. She darted off to the side and, with a quick flick of her wrist, cut through the board the hunters were using to seal the door. She didn't stop to be seen. Mariko hid behind a wall and threw out her sense. The two hunters had separated. They were acting as though they had nothing to fear. They had no idea they were being stalked. The thought of it made Mariko smile viciously. Suppressing her presence as completely as she could, Mariko tracked one hunter circling around the village to the east. He was methodical, stopping in each house and killing the inhabitants within. Just from sensing him, Mariko imagined he was proceeding in a very nonchalant manner, as though killing was no different than washing his clothes. It made his movements easy to predict. She sensed him as he stepped into another house and began killing the inhabitants within. Mariko sprinted to the door of the house and hid just to the side of it. The hunter, confident in his ability to sense all those around him, wouldn't even be wary. Her suspicions were correct. The hunter finished his work inside and turned to walk back out the door without a trace of suspicion. The moment he stepped through the door, Mariko made one cut, taking his head clean from his shoulders. The hunter had only had time to glance in surprise towards Mariko before it was too late. Mariko didn't stop to gloat over her victory. The other hunter would realize his partner had been killed and would know there was someone out there. He wouldn't allow himself to fall into an obvious trap. Mariko knew her second kill would be harder than the first. Again, Mariko's assumptions were correct. The other hunter came towards her. Mariko moved from house to house, always staying in cover and never allowing herself to be within her opponent's line of sight. She circled around and worked her way behind him, watching the hunter's movements carefully with her own sense. The second hunter stopped at the body of his companion, and Mariko risked a glance to see what her opponent looked like. What she saw surprised her. Her opponent was a hunter and a woman. Thus far, Mariko had only met male hunters. She had never seen a female among them. She shook and cleared her head. Man or woman, it made no difference. She was one of the hunters who had destroyed more than one village. A shrill cry of rage and grief rose from the hunter's throat, sending a chill down Mariko's spine. Clearly, Mariko had struck a nerve. The hunter cried out in the language of the Three Kingdoms. "Come out! Come out, you coward, so that I may end your life for you!" Mariko debated her options. She was a strong fighter, but she also knew her strength relied primarily on stealth, not on one-to-one combat. The safest course of action was to hide in the shadows and wait until she had an opportunity to strike with a clean kill once again. But some part of Mariko rebelled against the smart decision. She wasn't sure how long it would take to get another clean strike like the one she had gotten on the first hunter. While she waited for the perfect moment, this hunter could kill many more villagers. Mariko would have more blood on her hands. But what really drove her was the opportunity to kill the hunter face to face. She wanted the hunter to see her death coming for her. Before she could fully think it through, Mariko stepped away from the house she was hiding behind and walked into the small square where the hunter was waiting. She said nothing, holding her sword ready in front of her. The hunter's eyes took her in, running her up and down, and trying to judge her worth as an opponent based on her stance. Mariko stood there calmly doing the same. It was easy to see that the second hunter was a formidable enemy. Mariko didn't detect any flaws in her stance. "So, you must be the one we were warned about, the one that escaped." Mariko nodded. "Good. Then I will gain much honor among the demon kind for bringing them your head." The hunter leapt forward, conversation at an end. Mariko snapped and hid her presence from the sense in the same moment. She easily deflected the first cut, and the battle was joined in earnest. Her opponent was skilled, consistently pressing the attack, but always in balance and never leaving an opening for Mariko to strike. She may not have gotten any openings, but she also didn't feel as though she was in any danger. She could sense the cuts coming long before they arrived. If the hunter wanted to cut her, she would have to risk herself, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. The two women fought back and forth in the square, and Mariko noticed there were some curious eyes peeping out from doors and windows. She had hoped to get through the evening without being seen, but a battle in a public square wasn't the way to make that happen. Refocusing her attention, Mariko jumped 2 steps back, putting some space between her and her opponent. She didn't use the space to rest, but to launch her own attack, coming in with cuts as quick as she could make them. If it had been a contest of skill, Mariko wasn't sure she would have won. The hunter was excellent, and maybe even a hair faster than Mariko was. But the difference lay in their ability to sense their opponent. Mariko's sense worked against the hunter, and she knew where the hunter's cuts were going to be a moment before they happened. Mariko, with her ability to hide her intent and her strikes, may have been a little slower, but the hunter was reacting on sight alone, and a mistake was inevitable. In 2 more passes, it happened. The hunter tried to strike at Mariko, not sensing Mariko's own cut. Mariko cut a blood vessel in the hunter's leg, and although the hunter still stood, she was losing too much blood to live much longer. Her return to the great cycle was inevitable. Mariko watched the hunter's last moments carefully. A part of her wanted to ensure the hunter died without hurting anyone else, but another part of her was curious if impending death would change the hunter's mind. Perhaps, as the end neared, the hunter would have some revelation, some change of heart towards the terror she had committed. Mariko was sorely disappointed. The hunter glared at her and spat blood, even as she struggled to stay on her feet. She spoke loudly in the Azarian tongue, and although Mariko didn't know what she said, she was certain she was being cursed. It was, she reflected, a horrible way to spend one's last few moments. And then it was over. Mariko looked around at the devastation. She had stopped the hunters, but they had already caused an incredible amount of damage, not just to this village, but to many of the villages in the area. Mariko shook her head. She still felt like somehow she was losing. Since she had already been seen, Mariko went from house to house, checking to make sure people were okay and seeing if there were any injuries she could treat. By the time the sun rose, Mariko was tired enough to be a walking corpse and gratefully accepted an offer of shelter for the day. She fell asleep and felt no more. Chapter 5. Ryu's journey to the west became more curious every day. The old man had been interesting enough, and although Ryu believed him, a part of Ryu doubted how serious the situation had become. However, every day he traveled farther west and south, it became more apparent to him the old man had not been exaggerating. If anything, he had understated the severity of the problem. For 3 days after the meeting on the road, Ryu traveled in peace. The days were cold, but the sky was cloudless and the bright sun warmed Ryu as he covered the leagues to the hut he had grown up in. There were few travelers on the road, and those he did encounter seemed to be going about their business as usual. On the 4th day, the atmosphere on the road changed. It started in mid-morning, as Ryu was approaching a small village he had sometimes passed through growing up. He was 3 or 4 days of travel away from the hut, and the village had been one he and Shigeru had visited on occasion in the guise of wandering healers. They had not visited often, for it was a small village with few goods to trade. But Shigeru had not liked to appear in the same village twice in a row, and this village was one he occasionally visited to break up the trips to the others. Ryu was only a league away when he encountered a large group of people walking towards him. He stopped and stood aside as they approached and began to pass. Even though it had been cycles since he had seen them last, he recognized the inhabitants of the village he was nearing. As near as he could tell, everyone in the village was on the road that morning. As the villagers began to pass, several of them recognized him, and they called a stop to the procession. Their greetings were friendly, as one of the village elders shuffled up to Ryu.
"Young man, it has been a very long time since you have visited our village. It is a pleasure to meet you again, although a shame in such trying times."
The old man looked around.
"Where is your father?"
Ryu stared at the ground. "I am sorry I've not had the chance to tell you. My father passed away just over 2 cycles ago."
"I am very sorry to hear that. Your father was a great man and brought much healing to my people. We will always be grateful for him. What sends you south today?"
Ryu studied the old man, but there was no hint of guile in his demeanor. "I have received summons from a village farther south. I'm trying to carry on my father's work as best I can, and there are still those who need aid." The old man shook his head.
"Have you not heard?"
Ryu gave the old man a quizzical look. "Heard what?" The elder looked around, as if the very mention of what he was about to say would bring the demons from their hiding place.
"It is a hard time. Villages to the south are disappearing. They are burned, and the inhabitants either disappear or are killed. Always one survivor is left, one person to tell the story. The stories I have heard would chill your blood. With the war going on, there is no protection anymore. That is why we are on the road. We are going to New Haven to tell our story and seek shelter until these horrors have been laid to rest."
Ryu shook his head. "I have heard rumors, but I did not think they were true."
The old man nodded. "I once thought the same, but I've heard too much, and my people are scared. This is the only way to keep them safe."
Ryu and the elder talked for a little longer, but Ryu could see the villagers were eager to be traveling. With good conditions, it would still take them 5 or 6 days to reach New Haven from where they stood. Every moment seemed precious to them. Ryu received many invitations to join them, but he begged their leave, and before long they were behind him, continuing their long, slow march to their new sanctuary. As the day wore on, Ryu encountered more and more people traveling towards New Haven. He didn't again encounter an entire village, but the number of people he saw could have filled many of the villages he knew. Ryu estimated he had passed at least 100 that day alone. That night, Ryu made camp with another small group of travelers, 4 families that reminded him eerily of the group he had been traveling with so long ago when Shigeru found him. Their story was no different than anyone else's. They had heard the rumors, and one of the men claimed to have met one of the survivors. Once the children were sound asleep, the man related what he had heard firsthand from the survivor. According to the survivor, they never expected their fate. One day everything in the village had been fine. The harvest had been good and the people were content. They went to bed, unsuspecting, and many of them never woke up again. Bodies were pinned to walls, and the village was painted red with blood. Ryu looked from traveler to traveler as the story was told, and he could see that each believed completely in the story. That night he had trouble falling asleep. Not because of fear or the story he had heard, but because of curiosity. There was no doubt in his mind something was happening to the south, but the stories he was hearing were grotesque, almost beyond comprehension. The next day was more of the same. If anything, there were even more travelers on the road than there had been the day before. A mass exodus was occurring from the far reaches of the southern kingdom, but Ryu saw no response from the military or the government. Though the sun was bright, the feeling on the road was one of dread. People were almost tripping over each other in their haste to escape. All were traveling to New Haven, expecting it would be a refuge from the horrors to the south. People seemed suspicious of everyone they met, and the kind greetings Ryu had experienced the day before became few and far between. More often than not, groups and families would walk past Ryu without a word. More than once he received suspicious looks, as he was the only one traveling south. Ryu feared what would happen when all these people came to New Haven. It was a large city, but it was already full, and it couldn't handle the number of people seeking refuge inside. His thoughts traveled to Akira and Tanak, and he hoped they had a solution for their frightened subjects. Ryu considered leaving the road. If he still had his sense, it would have been the obvious decision. As it was, he was being seen by everyone. Although he wasn't attracting undue attention, he was sure that once people saw his wanted posters in New Haven, word would get out about what direction he had traveled. He suspected there would be those who would connect whatever was happening in the outskirts of the kingdom to him. But without his sense, Ryu was blind. Off the road, away from people, he would be a sitting target for any who would take his life. He did not see or notice anyone following him, but he couldn't shake the feeling he wasn't safe yet. He picked up his pace. More than anything else, he wanted to get to Mariko. He hoped that once he did, they could make some sense of the world as it fell into chaos. There were 2 of them because there were always 2. One to track, another to kill. It was the tracker who noticed the man. They had been hiding along the road for a day, debating whether to attack the villagers or let them crush the nearby city with their overwhelming numbers. They had feasted on plentiful game while they argued. The warrior wanted to attack. If even the roads were unsafe, who knew how the people would react? He argued they would scatter throughout the land, easy to pick off in ones or twos. The tracker disagreed. He liked the idea of everyone going into one city. That way they would be easy to find. Also, they would carry the fear with them, causing riots and panic. Then they could walk into the city and cut it off from its miserable existence. The two of them argued back and forth, neither particularly concerned about the outcome. The work was easy, almost demeaning. Their leader had spoken truly. There were few, if any, who possessed any strength in this land. The tracker sensed the man moving against the tide of humanity. They knew they were in the approximate area where this prey had been found previously, but they hadn't really expected to find him. The prey's hiding place had been discovered, and the man and woman should have moved on. But perhaps they were braver, or more stupid, than the demon-kind thought. Regardless, the man was moving against the tide, and he carried a blade, his eyes wandering back and forth restlessly. The tracker could not sense his power, but the way he walked gave him away. The man was a warrior, and even if he wasn't the Nightblade their leader sought, perhaps he'd be strong enough to be a challenge. The debate between the two was short-lived. Both of them detested slaughtering cattle. They would follow this man, and perhaps he would lead them to even more worthy prey. Chapter 6. Akira sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers he was convinced had no end. Ever since Tanakh had ridden out to treat with the Azarians, his life had been nothing but an endless stretch of paperwork. Merging the two kingdoms was a simple idea, but the practicalities of combining two lands were enough to drive him to insanity. There were questions on how to merge the armies, who to appoint to new roles in the kingdom, and how to spread out food and supplies for the coming winter. Even though Akira sat in his warm tent, daily he was reminded of the brutal nature of the weather outside. Though they were only in the first moon of winter, already snow swirled throughout the land, even in the remains of the southern kingdom. Akira was predisposed to treat the people of his land better than those in Tanakh's. His land had been torn apart by invasion, and he couldn't shake his natural impulse to give his people the best of everything. But he was wrong, and he knew it. As much as he detested the manner in which the new kingdom had been formed, it was a historic moment. For over 1,000 cycles there had been 3 kingdoms, the remnants of one great kingdom held together by a treaty that had lasted much longer than anyone expected. Tanakh had broken the treaty, but in so doing had created the opportunity for 2 kingdoms to become one. It caused the death of far too many good men, but Akira saw it as his duty to make their sacrifice worthwhile. He may have lost his kingdom, but he could do everything in his power to ensure this fragile peace would last. So, despite his desire to subtly sabotage the new treaty by providing his own people with the best of everything, Akira worked to find solutions to provide for all. The problems were not trivial. As Akira looked over the ledgers and documents of the old Western Kingdom, he realized how close Tanakh and his kingdom had come to utter ruin. If Tanakh hadn't invaded, his kingdom would have fallen within the next 5 cycles. The papers in front of him were light, but the task in front of him was heavy. The Southern Kingdom had been a healthy kingdom, but Akira wasn't sure it was healthy enough to support so many new people. To complicate matters, Akira could not bring himself to believe in Tanakh's promises. He wasn't sure what Tanakh knew or thought, but the last reports he had received from Toro made it clear the Azarians had come with an invasion force. Any other conclusion was preposterous. Akira hoped there was some chance Tanakh would be able to create a peace, but in his heart he thought it would be impossible. He was certain that as soon as the pass opened, there would be tens of thousands of Azarians, hungry for land and blood, flooding the new kingdom. It went against the orders Tanakh had given him, but Akira was trying to balance the need to prepare for invasion with the needs of distributing supplies among all the people. It was a delicate task, but Akira did all he could within the freedom he had. If the logistics of merging two kingdoms weren't headache enough, reports were beginning to trickle in from the edges of his old kingdom. The first one or two that crossed his desk he wrote off as unlikely. But as the days passed and new reports joined the old, the more certain he was the invasion had already begun. There were at least a handful of hunters in his kingdom, destroying villages and spreading fear. The rational part of Akira's mind admired the diabolical efficiency of the strategy. At most, there were only a few dozen hunters in his land, but given enough time, they would tear his people apart just as surely as an invading army. It was the same type of fear-based attack used in the siege of Fort Azuma, just on a much larger scale. The worst part was that Akira didn't know how to respond. If they had been a more traditional opponent, Akira would have tasked squads and units to deal with the problem. However, he was certain they were dealing with hunters. If his intuition was correct, sending troops to fight and search for the hunters would be a waste of manpower and time. Any force large enough to kill a pair of hunters would be too large to spare, especially considering they had no idea where the hunters actually were. They were clearly working their way north, but they struck at random, and there was no predicting where their next attack would be. If Ryu had still been around, Akira would have asked him. But thanks to Tanakh, one of the only people who could help was a fugitive from the very people that needed his protection. Fortunately, there had been no sightings of him since he escaped the camp. Akira didn't know where he had gone, but a small part of him hoped Ryu was out there, trying to save the kingdom. It was a lot to ask, but Akira believed in him. Without any good options, Akira was forced to do nothing, forced into inaction as the hunters slowly tore apart his land with fear. Akira shook his head. If he let his thoughts go down this road, it was hard for him to turn back. There was a lot happening he couldn't control, but the papers and decisions in front of him were things he could influence, and strong decisions now could mean the difference between the survival and annihilation of his kingdom. He must not lose focus. Akira rolled his shoulders back and grabbed a new piece of paper. There was work to be done. Akira was hard at work when the messenger entered his tent. Akira knew at once something horrible had happened, something important. Most messengers came into the tent with a crisp and practiced ease. This messenger looked as though he was walking toward his own execution. He was nervous, fidgeting in place as he waited for Akira to call for him. Akira eyed him carefully. He recognized the man, knew he was well respected as a runner throughout the camp. The man had been one of Tanakh's, but Akira found no fault in his service. He always delivered his messages calmly and efficiently, and if Akira recalled correctly, the man also had a reputation for courage on the battlefield. Looking at him now, though, it was hard to believe any of those things. Akira motioned for the messenger to sit. "What is it? I fear you bring me terrible news." "You are not wrong, my lord. The news is grave. One of Tanakh's honor guard just returned from the mountains. He is nearly frozen solid, and the healers are not sure he will live, but he brought a message." Akira waited patiently, although his heart beat faster. "My lord, the guard was carrying Tanakh's head. He told a story difficult to believe. They were ambushed in the mountains by the leader of the Azarians, even though they rode under a banner of peace. They were killed with very little conversation, and the leader handed Tanakh's head to the guard. The only message he delivered was to tell us he was coming." Akira took the news in as calmly as he could. A part of him leapt for joy. He hated Tanakh for invading his kingdom, and he wouldn't shed any tears knowing the Lord of the Western Kingdom had met his end, particularly due to his own hubris. But at the same time, this was a clear message from the man Mariko called Nameless. The Azarians would come, and Akira was afraid his people wouldn't have the strength to withstand the forces arrayed against them. His mind raced, but he knew what he had to take care of first.
"Take me to his head."
The messenger hesitated. "My lord, there is no need. The head is frozen and grotesque, and those who knew him well have identified it. There is no reason for you to look upon it." Akira thought about the messenger's words and their hidden meaning. It was no secret the men of the Western Kingdom and the men of the Southern Kingdom did not see eye to eye. Tanakh's death was a blow to his men, and Akira would have to tread gently. He was now the lord of the Southern Kingdom, but keeping it together would be far from simple. Akira shook his head. "There is. I have no doubt about your report. Tanakh and I may not have been friends, but he was one of the lords of the Three Kingdoms, and as such was one of the two men who best understood me. He deserves my respects." The messenger thought for a moment and then nodded. Akira let out a silent sigh of relief. With any luck, the messenger would spread the word of his reaction throughout the camp. If he wasn't careful, the armies would split in the next few days. With a gesture, the messenger led Akira out of the tent. The camp around them was abuzz with activity. One of Akira's first actions in Tanakh's absence had been to work on merging the armies of the two kingdoms. Both were depleted after a season of warfare, and stragglers were still coming in daily. Everyone was organizing, meeting their new units, and beginning to train together. Akira's two top generals, Makoto and Mashiro, had been instrumental in organizing the task, but even as they were so close to creating order, chaos reared its ugly head again. The tent the messenger led Akira to was black, a place where corpses were stored until they could be properly honored. Even now, bodies were coming in from the battlefield to be identified, if possible. The men who worked in the tent were grim, but Akira was grateful for their service. Families deserved to know what had happened to their fathers, brothers, and sons. The messenger led him to the back of the tent, a place set aside and quiet. There, on a bench, was a blanket covering a lump. Akira had seen death before and didn't shy away from the sight. He gently pulled aside the blanket himself. The head was definitely Tanakh's. Dueling emotions coursed through Akira. A part of him was elated, and he couldn't deny that. The man who had invaded his kingdom, the man who had brought death and destruction to his people, had rejoined the great cycle, and Akira was glad. Tanakh's death made him the ruler of the largest kingdom the land had seen for over 1,000 cycles. He had more men and more resources than any other lord in history. His mind raced with possibilities. But he was also afraid. He was afraid for his kingdom, young as it was. They faced a threat stronger than any they had ever encountered. It would be easy to let the blame for failure fall on Tanakh's shoulders, but all that mattered now was he was the lord standing between the Azarians and his people. He wasn't sure if he was up to the task, but he had to try. He covered Tanakh's head. There would be much to do in the coming days. He had full authority to make changes now, and he would. Tanakh would be given a proper ceremony to mark his passing. The men needed to be organized. 1,000 other tasks ran through his mind, but one stood at the front of them all. He needed to meet with Sen. Akira rode on horseback through the northern kingdom, the second time he had done so within this cycle. His body was sore from his time in the saddle, but they pushed forward. Time was of the essence, every day a precious gift of preparation for the invasion Akira was certain was coming. They rode from sunrise to sunset, as long as the terrain around them was clear. Akira had pressed his men to ride in the evenings, but Captain Young, the commander of his honor guard, didn't permit it. They weren't expecting an ambush, but the rumors of terror roaming the southern kingdom had made everyone nervous. They rode only so long as the sun lit their way. Fortunately, the weather had held for them. It had been a winter marked by storms, but they encountered nothing more trying than softly falling snow on their journey. Akira was grateful. He had never been to the northern kingdom in winter. Summers were challenging enough in the high mountains. He couldn't imagine how the people here survived the winters, and had little desire to find out himself. Due in large part to the lack of storms, visibility was incredible, and Akira basked in the stark mountain beauty of the northern kingdom. Majestic peaks rose in the distance, gorgeous and hostile. Akira wondered at the men who lived near such mountains, and was grateful he wouldn't have to climb those peaks. Sen had replied quickly to Akira's messengers, naming a different place for their meeting. Akira had expected to return to Stonekeep, the capital of the northern kingdom, but Sen had chosen a tea house much further south, making the journey quicker for Akira and his men. Akira wondered at the meaning of the gesture. Sen did nothing without reason, but Akira couldn't puzzle out the old lord's intent. By all accounts, the last time Akira had been to the northern kingdom, he had failed. He had hoped to best Tanakh at a conclave, but his plan had shattered like fragile glass, and instead of unseating Tanakh, he found himself the target of a coordinated attempt at the reunification of the kingdoms. He still questioned what had happened at the conclave, and hoped to have answers soon. In the eye of the public, Akira had done well, but he knew he had disappointed Sen, and that bothered him. He respected the old lord, almost as a father. As he approached the meeting place, Akira considered his options. There must be a way to stop the Azarians from entering the kingdom. Toro had ordered the first all the way out of the pass. They didn't even man the high ambush locations throughout. Akira had been angry when he first heard Toro's orders, but on further reflection, they had been the right decisions. Hunters would find and kill any of the ambushers. If they had been fighting a traditional enemy, they could have held the pass easily, even in the summer. But an army reinforced with hunters was a very different beast. Akira would have lost more men with no benefit. So now there was only one choke point at the northern end of the Three Sisters, where the pass opened up into the southern kingdom itself. Akira and his troops would have some small advantage when it came to terrain, but the kingdoms had never faced a force like this. They weren't strong enough. Akira's plan was simple. They needed more troops to defend against the invasion, and the only troops available were Sen's. Not only did they represent more manpower, but their skill in the mountains was unparalleled, and Akira would give anything to have them assisting in the defense of the kingdoms. His primary goal was to convince Sen they were needed. Akira and his honor guard crested the ridge overlooking the valley the tea house was in. Akira had never been here before, and he slowed his horse to a halt as he took in the view. The sun was bright and cold in the crisp blue sky. Off in the distance, perhaps a league off, Akira could see the tea house. Sen's own honor guard was stationed nearby. The mountains here were beyond gorgeous, hard snow-capped peaks stabbing at the sky. Akira imagined the valley in the summer, filled with blooming wildflowers. It would be a wonderful sight. There was a peace in this valley, ideal for the meeting they were about to hold. They were still some way off from the tea house when Akira ordered his honor guard to halt. There was no need for Sen or his guards to get nervous. Akira was here on a mission of peace, and if he couldn't trust Sen, there wasn't anyone left to trust. His guards didn't have to like it, and Captain Young fixed him with a stare that would have frozen a lesser man, but Akira rode on alone. As he tied up his horse, Sen emerged from the tea house to greet him. Like Akira, Sen was alone. They greeted each other as old friends, and Sen invited him into the tea house. The house was warm and cozy, heated by a roaring fire and protected from the brisk winter air by surprisingly thick walls. They sat down, and Sen served him tea. Akira watched with interest. Sen was old, but every movement he made was sure and precise. He had a great many cycles left to live, and Akira was glad it was so. When his tea was prepared, Akira sipped at it gently. It was a delicate blend, the best he had tasted in some time. Akira complimented Sen, and as was appropriate, they spent the first part of their time together speaking of trivial matters. A part of Akira wanted to hurry and get to the point, but a few moments here made no difference in the larger scheme of things, and the tradition was comforting. Akira found himself relaxing and enjoying his time with Sen. The tension fell away from his shoulders. He had known the older lord since he was a child. He remembered trips to the Northern Kingdom every cycle with his father, meeting Sen and sitting on his lap. At the time, Sen had been one of the youngest rulers of a kingdom, although well into adulthood. Now, so many cycles later, Sen was still here, and he was the only other person alive who knew what it really meant to be a lord. It was Sen who brought them to the point at hand, and Akira was almost disappointed when the peaceful spell was broken. "The world has been shifting. I was sorry to hear about Tanakh." Akira couldn't decide between honesty and politeness, so he kept his tone neutral. "It was a surprise to learn about his death." Sen allowed the silence to grow between them. Akira considered several approaches to broaching the question, but Sen knew him well. Straightforward and honest was his best bet. "I would like nothing more than to sit and talk, old friend, but the time for decisions is at hand. I have come here to ask for your aid in repelling the Azarian invasion. There are no troops better suited for mountain warfare than yours, and we desperately need more men." Akira let Sen have time to think. He suspected Sen had guessed Akira's purpose before the visit, but these weren't decisions to be made lightly. While he waited, he poured them each some more tea. Technically, it was rude for the guest to pour tea for the host, but Sen understood the gesture for what it was, a simple kindness. He sipped softly at his tea while he looked out on the snow-covered landscape outside. When Sen spoke, his voice was soft, as if he feared that if he spoke too loudly, the fragile peace that existed would be torn apart. "I do not know if I am willing to entrust my troops to you. My heart wants to believe you, but events of the past moons have made me doubt your motives. I would be a foolish lord indeed if I entrusted the safety of my kingdom to one who acted so rashly this past summer." Akira controlled his reaction. He had hoped Sen had forgiven him, but there was no reason to. No words he could say would change Sen's mind. The old man always thought carefully, and if he said something, it was final. Akira had prayed it wouldn't come to this, but he couldn't leave the valley without Sen's troops. He hadn't even told his closest advisors of his real plan. "I understand. If you wish, I would be willing to cede the lordship of the Southern Kingdom to you if you would lend your aid. All I ask in return is that you work with my 2 remaining generals. They are experienced and have valuable advice to provide." Sen studied Akira closely, the only sound in the tea-house the crackling of the burning wood. "You would relinquish your claim to the Southern Kingdom?" Akira nodded. He knew the implication. The kingdom would be whole again, but he wouldn't be king. "The last report I received from General Toro indicated several tens of thousands of Azarians ready to advance on our land, reinforced by an unknown number of hunters. They don't mean to retake Fort Azuma, as Tanakh somehow imagined. They mean to take all our land. The only place we can stand against them is the northern opening to the pass. But we'll need every soldier we can get. The continuation of our kingdoms is all that matters. If that means giving up command, I do so gladly." Sen sipped at his own tea, finally standing and pacing the room. Akira sat still, allowing the older lord the opportunity to decide on his best course of action. Sen was a strong ruler, and no words from Akira would sway his decision one way or the other. Sen stopped and stared at Akira, as though it were some sort of trap. "Would you insist on being second in line to the throne?" Akira shook his head. "The decision would be entirely yours. I would be honored to serve, but you can use me in whatever capacity you think best. You are well loved across the kingdoms, and my people will follow you without question." Sen continued his pacing. He spoke, and Akira was surprised. It almost seemed as though he was thinking aloud. "You surprise me, Lord Akira. After the conclave, I was convinced you were a man driven by pride. Your actions were desperate, and you didn't give up your land then, even though it would have reunited the kingdom." Akira frowned, speaking before he realized he might offend the older lord. "You and Tanakh were coordinated against me. I am proud of my kingdom, and I couldn't bear to lose it to such political conniving." The older lord chortled to himself. "You believed Tanakh and I were allies, that I knew and supported his campaign through my actions. That explains much." "What do you mean?" Akira couldn't hide his confusion. "I can see where you might have thought that, but this is the truth. I never coordinated with Tanakh any more than I coordinated with you. I was willing to give up my kingdom because I desperately want to see the land reunited once again, even if it meant allowing Tanakh to become our first king." The whole world shifted for Akira, and in one moment he realized just how wrong he had been. He ran through the entire conclave in his mind again, seeing it with a new perspective. He had underestimated Sen terribly. Akira bowed his head to the floor. "Forgive me, Lord Sen. I have been a fool." Sen laughed, and Akira looked up. "If only we could have had this conversation several moons ago. We'd live in a very different world. Well, there's no point dwelling on the past. What would you say if I suggested we merge our kingdoms today?" Akira was glad to already be sitting. It was the last thing he had expected Sen to say. Sen continued. "Furthermore, I would take you up on your offer to relinquish your status. I would ask that you not be anywhere in line for the throne. Already one lord has died with you underneath him. I would be foolish to become the second." Akira didn't rush to speak. He had come for troops, but if there was a chance to reunify the kingdoms once and for all, wasn't that an even better solution? He breathed in deeply and replied with a question. "Would you defend the pass with all your strength?" Sen nodded. "I believe your reports about the Azarians. My own shadows have echoed your concerns." Now it was Akira's turn to stand and pace. He hadn't expected a gesture so grand. To be reunified, just when it was most needed, was the exact step they needed to take if they were to have a chance against the Azarians. He would be a fool to refuse the offer. It would be hard to give up his authority, but he trusted Sen. Sen led his kingdom well, and his people were happy and prosperous, an even more incredible feat considering the difficult terrain they carved their lives out of. Handing over the southern kingdom was the right action to take. Sen deserved to be the kingdom's first king. Akira nodded. "I accept your offer. It is very generous of you, and I believe you would make an excellent king." Sen studied him again, and Akira felt like Sen could see right through him. Could it really be this easy? The three kingdoms had existed for over 1,000 cycles, and now they may unify in less time than it took to drink 2 cups of tea. Sen spoke. "Lord Akira, this is my suggestion. I have lived for many cycles, and I want to see our kingdoms unified. I was hurt this summer when the conclave failed, but I believe you have the best interests of the land at heart.
I will cede the northern kingdom to your care, and you shall become king of the kingdom, reformed once again. War is a task for the young, and I wish to prepare my people for the imminent invasion. I will act as first in line to the throne, but my land and my troops are yours."
Words couldn't express Akira's emotions. Joy, pride, gratitude, and hope all surged through his heart at the same time. He never could have anticipated the conversation taking the turn it had. He bowed to Sen, all the way to the floor.
"I do not know what to say."
Sen smiled.
"Sometimes it is best not to say anything at all."
Suddenly, Akira was a child again, looking up to Sen and marveling at his wisdom. The man who was a lord fell away, and Akira faced Sen as he was. "Sen, I'm scared for our land. Even together, I'm not sure we can stand against the Azarians." Sen nodded.
"I am too, but we'll fight them together."
They sat and talked until the sun was high in the sky. There was much to accomplish, but they set out the basic terms of the treaty that would unify their lands. Both were willing to compromise, so the treaty was easy to form. The sun was setting when they finally finished. With another tremendous bow of gratitude, Akira left the tea house, eager to begin the return journey. He had entered the valley a lord, but he left it a king, the first the land had seen in over 1,000 cycles. Chapter 7. The cold wind blew down from the pass, but Nameless didn't care. He was demon-kind, and weather had no meaning to him. He was separate, above such small concerns as wind or rain. But his people kept to their shelters. It was not often so cold further south in Azaria, but despite their discomfort, Nameless didn't dare allow the clans to spread too far from the pass. Their alliance was fragile as it was, continuing to exist only due to great need. The winter had barely begun, and already food was an issue. They had found a little in the fort, and his demon kind were scouring the mountains for game, but it would be a hard winter. It would destroy the weak. Nameless did not believe in anything greater than himself. He held to no god and no belief system. There was only his own strength and skill. He stifled the urge to pray for the pass to open as soon as possible. He didn't know how much longer he could keep the people looking forward. Even his own demon kind were having trouble following the narrow game trails which led to the southern kingdom. If the winter season continued its ferocity, he'd soon be completely shut off from news of the three kingdoms. Today, however, Nameless was grateful for the wind and the snow. He wandered far afield of the collection of clans, allowing his abilities to guide him. He could feel the old man, a beacon in these desolate plains. Those of the clans wouldn't give him a second look, but his presence was as bright as the sun to Nameless and his gift. He came upon the old man when the sun was high in the sky. The old man certainly knew Nameless was present, but made no move to recognize him. Nameless knew the old man's mind was wandering far and wide, seeing events far beyond the sight of a normal human. It was a useful skill, but one Nameless did not understand. It would be far too much to say that Nameless was scared of the old man, but being in the presence of such an unknown caused him discomfort. The head of the Azarians sat down and waited patiently. He didn't know if the old man was actually focused elsewhere, or if he just enjoyed making Nameless wait. For most, such an idea would be unthinkable, but the old man didn't fear Nameless. He knew he was too useful to be killed. Nameless wasn't a man known for his patience, but this old man was the only one alive who possessed the skill of far-seeing, and Nameless required him. Whether the old man was teasing him or not, he had to bear it for a while longer yet. The moment the three kingdoms were conquered, Nameless would end the old man and rejoice in his death. When the old man opened his eyes, Nameless was ready.
What news, old man? There is much happening to the north. I know that. I would hear of it.
Nameless's companion sighed, as if wearied of such a rush.
The young man, the one who strikes as fast as the wind, wanders back to the place he called home once before. But there is something different about him now. He is silent, and if I were to guess, I would say he has lost his gift.
The news startled Nameless. He did not know the lore of the Nightblades in the north, but no demon kind in his memory had ever lost the gift. He didn't think such a thing was possible. The old man chuckled softly to himself.
It is not unheard of. You should spend more time studying and less time conquering. There is much to learn.
Nameless almost drew his blade then. Skill or no skill, he wouldn't tolerate such disrespect from anyone. But the old man was too useful, and he knew it. Nameless wondered if the seer had a death wish.
You'll be pleased to learn 2 of the demon kind have found him. They are on his trail now. I expect they believe he will lead them to the young woman who cut you.
And what of her? Nameless could barely control his anger at the thought of her. She would die at his hands. That was a promise he had made to himself.
She is the void. I cannot feel her from here. I'm not sure I could if she was right next to me. But 2 more demon kind have fallen, only a few days from the place the 2 of them used to live. I suspect it was her.
How can you know? The old man shrugged.
There's nothing else that can kill us without me noticing it.
Nameless stood and paced, although his pacing was more akin to a light jog for most people. In his larger plan, the loss of 2 demon kind was but a drop of water in a sea, but each one was valuable to him. Each one had a gift that should not be wasted. Never before had the demon kind fallen as prey to others. If word were to get out, the fragile truce that held between the clans would melt like fat in a frying pan. The Nightblades had to die. Nameless turned and left the old man without a word. There was much more he needed to learn, but everything else could wait. He needed to meet with the other demon kind and decide what must be done about the Nightblades. The Farseer watched the leader of all the clans rush off in a hurry. He shook his head, fearing for the fate of the people under such a fiery leader.
You're welcome,
he whispered softly to Nameless's retreating back. It was evening when the council gathered. There were days when Nameless would have preferred to go without, but the trappings of tradition were strong. The people had never had a government, not like the sheep who lived in the 3 kingdoms. For as long as their stories went back, the people had always been a collection of clans. The closest they got to government was the Gathering, their once-a-cycle celebration. The demon kind were different, though. They were a clan without a clan. They took no names and served wherever they were needed. Each had been born into a clan, but now their only loyalty lay to each other and the people as a whole. Long ago it had been decided that the demon kind needed control. Each of them was strong, and taken together, their strength was enough to shape the course of legends. That power had to be harnessed, and it had been decreed that no single person could decide the path of the demon kind. And so the Council of Demonkind had been born. When Nameless had decided to rise to power to save the people, his first task had been to convince the Council his plan was necessary and right. If he had failed, he would have been killed by the Demonkind. He was strong, but not strong enough to stand against the combined strength of his brethren. So even though he was the leader of all the clans, when it came to matters involving the Demonkind, he still had to approach the Council and ask permission. If he lost the Council, he lost the people. They would scatter to the 4 winds, declining in strength and numbers until they disappeared completely. No more stories would be told. Nameless considered his words carefully. What he was about to propose was unheard of. When he looked at everything happening, it seemed a small and easy decision to make, but it was without precedent, and he knew his decision would be contested. He held the majority of votes in the council, but it was a slim margin, and there were several who would abandon him if they felt he was losing his strength. Before he spoke, he looked around the fire to see who had come. Many who he considered friends were gathered there, but they were almost matched by those who disagreed with him. They all had the best interests of the people at heart. They just had different ways of thinking about their problems. There still weren't enough people who saw the danger the people were in. Today, the lack of game and food seemed like a temporary problem, but Nameless had ridden far and wide, and he knew there weren't enough animals left in the land to continue to feed their growing numbers. They needed a new land, a richer land. They needed the Three Kingdoms.
Greetings, friends. I've called you here today because I have need of your strength. The two Nightblades in the Three Kingdoms continue to be a thorn in our side. They bring hope to the land, strengthening it prior to our invasion.
Nameless knew the last part was his own fiction, but he had to convince the council their actions today would save the lives of the people come spring. He didn't believe the two Nightblades could have that much of an influence on events, but they had to be eliminated. He had underestimated them too often. It wouldn't happen again.
I propose we send 4 pairs into the Three Kingdoms to eliminate the Nightblades once and for all.
The demon kind were not known for dramatic expression, but Nameless took note of every raised eyebrow. There were many around the fire, even among those he considered allies. One of the eldest demon kind was the first to speak. Nameless respected his opinion.
4 pairs have never been sent on a single task before.
Nameless nodded.
I know how much I ask, but we sent 2 pairs against just one of them, and they never returned. It is more than we've ever sent, but the danger is greater than we've ever faced. The only way to ensure our success is to send more than we ever have before.
One of the younger members of the council spat into the fire.
It is disgraceful to send so many. Send 1 pair who knows which part of their sword to hold, and we will be done with this foolish game.
Nameless eyed the youth warily. The young had never seen true hardship, not yet. Because of this, they felt they were invincible. They were a danger to his cause. If he reminded the youth that several demon kind had already died at the hands of the Nightblades, the youth would tell him the old men were getting weak and insist a pair of his generation be sent. Nameless considered the possibility. If these Nightblades were as good as he thought they would destroy a younger pair without a thought. The idea was tempting, if only to teach a lesson. But every demon kind was precious, and he wouldn't waste them to teach others a lesson. He couldn't bring himself to be that petty. He kept his silence. Several voices added their opinion to that of the youth. Nameless kept track of each, noting who was for the idea and who was against, and the reasons they gave. There was little duplicity in the council, and almost all spoke the truth of their opinions. There were some who supported Nameless in his plan, but many were against. Some were opposed because of the slight against their reputation. Others worried they were sending more and more demon kind to their deaths. Time was a piece of the decision as well. The game trails were becoming more dangerous, and even seasoned mountain explorers were having difficulty making the trek from Azaria to the Three Kingdoms and back. Soon the mountains would be impassable. Nameless made his last attempt.
I respect the wisdom and the voices that have spoken tonight. The problem in front of us is small, but we mustn't forget how it relates to the larger effort. The people must take the northern lands once the pass is open. Much more than our pride is at stake. The Nightblades must be killed. We think of the deaths of our kind, as we should, but our lives and deaths mean little when we look at everything happening.
The Nightblades aren't dangerous because they kill us. They are dangerous because they inspire hope. Their very existence screams that we can be defeated. But if we break them, we are that much closer to breaking the three kingdoms. One of the elders spoke. He hadn't added his voice to the discussion yet, but his quiet voice carried an air of command. Even Nameless was attentive. If you believe these Nightblades are the threat you make them out to be, I am inclined to believe you. We know they have already killed too many of us. 4 pairs is unheard of, but perhaps necessary. But you rush when no hurry is needed. Already 20 pairs cover the northern land, and the Nightblades can't physically track them all down in the winter season. Fear will still spread, but give the trails time to open, then strike first in the spring. Allow our invasion to begin with the death of these heroes. Nameless considered the old man's advice. In his heart, he wanted the Nightblades dead, but he recognized his hatred for them was personal. They endangered the mission he had set before his people. Their lives were an insult to his, especially the woman's. He would have her head. That was a promise he intended to keep. But the advice was well said. Sending pairs now risked their lives needlessly in the crossing. Besides, from the reactions he was getting from the council, they wouldn't approve sending pairs now. It was a compromise that pained him, but perhaps it was necessary. Nameless nodded his agreement, and the decision was quickly made. In the spring, 4 pairs would be sent to herald the invasion of the people. The Nightblades would die, and the 3 kingdoms would fall. Chapter 8. After the night she killed the 2 hunters in the village, Mariko never let herself stay too long in one place. The hut was still the center of her wanderings, and she came back to it from time to time to both drop off and gather supplies, but she never stayed for more than a night. Rumors of hunters in the land still flew from the lips of those she met, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to separate rumor from truth. She visited every village within 4 days of the hut, but she didn't encounter hunters again, even if the rumors implied she was surrounded by them. Some of the villages were empty, deserted in the middle of winter. Visiting those villages spooked Mariko the most. They reminded her too much of the abandoned city she had encountered in Azaria. The emptiness was menacing, as though the silence held the promise of violence. Mariko trusted her sense, but it was still hard to believe a village didn't possess a single living soul. She walked through quickly and went on her way. Other villages reacted differently. Many had seen people leave, but some citizens stayed. They didn't go outside often, but they would still open the door to a friendly face. Whether people stayed or left, the fear was palpable everywhere Mariko went. It was obvious the hunters were trying to spread panic, and just as obvious they were succeeding. It made Mariko want to scream, but screaming did little good, so she continued on her rounds, wearing herself out a little more every day. It would have been easier if her mind wasn't on other things, like Tomatsu and Ryu. Recently it was Tomatsu she thought of the most. Her memories of him had been warm, and she had grieved privately when she thought he had died. He had never been the person she hoped he would be, but he had always been kind to her, and that was more than could be said for anyone else at the monastery. It had been a delight to see him alive after so many cycles had passed, but she still struggled to understand the events that forced her to take his life. She tried to convince herself she hadn't had a choice, that he had forced her hand by dealing with the hunters and drawing his blade. But she knew it wasn't true. Ryu was fond of saying that people always had a choice. It was a phrase he had learned from Shigeru, and it had seeped into Mariko's beliefs as well. She could have run away, could have tried to knock him unconscious, but in the moment she had killed him without much thought. It was survival, Mariko thought. Tomatsu made himself a threat, and her survival was paramount. She would kill for it without hesitation. It was a truth she had learned about herself while traveling through Azaria. She was strong and would do whatever it took to keep living. As the Azarians would say, the strong survived. As soon as Tomatsu had drawn his sword against her, his life had been forfeit in her eyes. Equally concerning were the documents Tomatsu had been carrying. Some of the documents were maps of the three kingdoms more detailed than any she had ever seen. They denoted mountains, villages, hiding places, and locations of strategic importance. The maps, combined with the actual meeting of Tomatsu and the hunters, painted a clear idea in Mariko's mind. In some way, at least some of the monasteries were working with the hunters, to an end Mariko couldn't imagine. Along with the maps were a pile of other papers, filled with writing Mariko didn't recognize. She figured it must be some sort of code or a language she didn't understand. No matter how much time she spent looking over the papers, she couldn't decipher them. For all she knew, they could have been a collection of recipes. Given the context in which she had obtained them, she doubted it, but there was no way of knowing. Her mind wandered with possibilities. At least one monk was collaborating with the hunters, but were more. It could be a single monastery, or it could be the entire system. Mariko wondered how deep the treachery ran, and what it meant for the three kingdoms. The monasteries didn't have armies, but they were powerful nonetheless. The people held them in deep respect. The monasteries were the last remnants of the Blades of Legend. Without answers, her mind circled upon itself more often than she circled the hut. When she wasn't thinking about the monasteries and their role in the invasion, she was wondering what had happened to Ryu. She'd had no word from him, but she wasn't sure there would be any way for him to get word to her. Messengers were scarce in this part of the world. It had been almost half a cycle since she had seen him, and so much had changed for her. As though thinking about him made it so, one afternoon as she returned to the hut, she sensed him. She had just completed another circle of the surrounding villages and had come back with more supplies when she felt a presence within the hut. Her initial reaction was surprise. It had been so long, but it couldn't be anyone else. She paused and extended her sense carefully. There was someone within the hut, and it felt like Ryu, but it also didn't. Mariko was hard-pressed to describe her sensations. It felt like Ryu, but different. The power she was used to feeling from him no longer pressed against her mind. It was as though he were a normal person. Her heart went out to him. What had happened? Had he lost his strength just as she found hers? Mariko moved to rush to the hut, but then she felt other presences on her sense. There were two of them, hiding well out of sight of the hut. She could feel the tendrils of the sense as they snaked towards the hut. They could only be hunters, and if Ryu had lost his power, he was helpless before them. She sat on her heels, considering the problem. Was he bait? And if so, was he willing or unwilling? There were no answers to her questions, but Mariko hadn't come this far to be intimidated now. She swallowed her fear and walked towards the hut, right into the trap. When Mariko entered the hut, she saw it was Ryu waiting for her. He looked up and grinned, a wide smile Mariko didn't realize how much she had missed until that very moment. It was hard to believe after all this time they were face to face once again. Moments passed and the two of them looked at each other, each waiting for the other to make the first move. The last time she had seen him, she had been riding south into Azaria as he was preparing to start traveling north. It had only been a half cycle, but so much had happened. Mariko had thought she was going to die at least half a dozen times, but she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She came back a different person than the one who had left. Also, she had no idea what had happened to Ryu. He seemed fine, but there was a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. As happy as he was to see her, nothing could hide the sorrow he was experiencing. There was something else as well. She studied him closely. He was afraid. Of her? Whatever was going through his mind, he stood up and approached her, cautiously. "I've missed you." It was both a statement and a question, and in a flash of insight, Mariko understood. He felt abandoned when she chose not to return to Akira's camp. He had read her letter, but he hadn't believed it, and he was afraid he had lost her. Mariko wondered if he was right. If not for him, she never would have gone into Azaria, and although she was stronger for the experience, she wasn't sure she could forgive him, innocent as he was. Ryu took another tentative step, and for a moment all doubt was forgotten. Mariko stepped towards him, and the two of them embraced tightly. Neither seemed to trust themselves to speak. After a while they separated, and the words began to tumble out of Ryu's mouth. "Mariko, there's so much I have to say. I'm sorry for everything that's happened." Mariko didn't believe her eyes. In front of her, one of the strongest Nightblades in the land was acting like a blubbering idiot. She took a step back. She saw how his weight was off balance, how his head tilted forward. She wasn't the only one who had changed in the past half-cycle. Ryu had returned to her a different man. Mariko's first reaction was disgust. Ryu had always been strong. As long as she had known him, he had always been strong. He was the boy who always wanted to do right, no matter the cost. Even when he lost Shigeru and Takako, he never lost the belief he could help others. But she wasn't sure the Ryu in front of her believed in much of anything. He was weak and pitiful. But all the same, her heart went out to him. Perhaps she had spent too much time among the Azarians, believing that strength was all that mattered. Maybe the Ryu she had grown to love was still inside. He deserved a chance, if nothing else. Mariko threw out her sense. She still didn't notice anything unique about Ryu. Perhaps he was as broken as he seemed. The hunters sat outside the hut, still deep in the old woods. Mariko shook her head. If anything, they were predictable. They would wait until nightfall to strike. They had grown used to prey that relied on sight, but they didn't know, or had forgotten, that night was Mariko's domain. The moon was near full, but in the growth of the deep woods, that wouldn't matter. If the hunters weren't going to strike, they had time. Mariko went to put on tea, one part of her sense focused on the hunters to ensure they didn't surprise her. If her guess was right, Ryu wouldn't have the ability to fight them. It would be up to her. That afternoon they shared their stories. Ryu went first. He spoke about his journey to the island and what he had found there. He talked about the strength and knowledge he had gained, the power he had felt. But he also talked about the division on the island, how one faction wanted desperately to return to the Three Kingdoms, and another wanted to stay isolated. Ryu's story faltered when he reached the part about his decision to come for her. He told her how he had been able to sense what was happening to her, how he had originally left the island to come and rescue her. He spoke softly about Renzo's attack and how it had changed his mind, how he had known his only course of action was to go back to Akira. Mariko watched him as he explained his decision. There were hints of the Ryu she had known there. He knew she might hate him for his decision, but there was no lie in his voice. His story caused a flood of emotions to crash over Mariko. She was angry and upset, but also sad for the ordeals he had gone through. After Takako had died, he had hoped never to kill again. It had been a peaceful delusion until the hunters had appeared. But what tore him apart more than anything else was that he had been forced to kill a Nightblade. She knew it felt wrong to him, and it had been the final weight that broke him. Even though it had been the right decision, she was furious he had chosen to help Akira instead of continuing to ride south. The rational part of her mind knew it wouldn't have made a difference. According to his story, he wouldn't have reached her until she was already back at Fort Azuma. There was nothing he could have done, but it still angered her that he had chosen against her. Silence reigned over the hut as she paced. Ryu had told his story and would say no more unless prompted. He wasn't one to say more than was necessary. She glanced outside. Night was rapidly falling. Ryu broke the quiet. "I'd like to know what happened to you. You're different." Mariko glanced at him and glanced outside. She didn't have time to tell her story before the hunters attacked. "Not now. There's something I need to take care of." The look of fear flashed across Ryu's face. "You're leaving?" Mariko hadn't intended to tell him, but she was angry. "No, but 2 hunters followed you here." Ryu's look of fear was replaced by one of surprise. So it really was true. He couldn't use the sense and didn't know he had been followed. He knew if he fought them, he would lose, but he stood up anyway. Mariko shook her head. "You're in no condition to fight them. I will kill them and return." Ryu faltered for a moment. "By yourself?" Mariko laughed. "I'm stronger than you can imagine." Not wanting to get into an argument, she stepped outside and slipped into the darkness. Mariko's first hope was that Ryu wouldn't try to follow her. Even without his sense, he was an excellent swordsman, without doubt one of the finest in the 3 kingdoms. But it was foolish to attack hunters without the sense. They'd kill him in a moment. She was grateful that Ryu realized the same fact. Perhaps it had been the tone of her voice, or perhaps he knew he would be more a hindrance than a help in the upcoming battle. Whatever the reason, Ryu stood just inside the door. It wasn't much, but it was the most defensible position around. If Mariko fell, it was the only place he stood even a hint of a chance at cutting a hunter. Mariko strode confidently out into the woods. The moon was full, but in the shadows of the tall trees, her dark robes would be almost invisible. She let her presence seep out of her. She wanted their attention turned away from the hut. If they had been following Ryu, it seemed reasonable to assume they had already figured out his weakness. If so, their first target would be her. Once she was dead, Ryu would fall without difficulty. But Mariko didn't plan on allowing them that chance. She had come out of the caves of Azaria reborn, deadly. Mariko frowned as she felt the hunters begin to move. One came towards her, the other towards the hut. She cursed silently. Either these 2 hunters were very confident, or they didn't know who they were hunting. She guessed it was the former. Every hunter she had ever met had been proud. Despite all the hunters who had fallen to her blade, they still thought they were superior to her. The decision put Mariko in a bind. She had hoped to lure both of them away from the hut, but if only one followed her, it meant Ryu was in danger. Fighting both at the same time would have been harder, but it would have guaranteed Ryu's safety. It also meant she didn't get to fight the hunters on her terms. She would have preferred to creep up behind them and kill them silently. But if she tried that tonight, Ryu would die. It wasn't her style, but it was her only option. Mariko suppressed her presence completely and sprinted straight at the hunter following her. She crashed through the trees and leapt at the hunter. As she expected, the hunter wasn't surprised. His blade was drawn and the battle was immediately joined. The hunter was strong, fast, and experienced. To Mariko's frustration, he kept pulling her back, further away from the hut. In a flash of insight, Mariko realized their plan. They knew exactly who they were hunting. It wasn't the hunters who suffered from pride. It was her. The hunter in front of her was only to keep her busy, to draw her away from Ryu. The second hunter would kill Ryu quickly. They knew if he died, she wouldn't be able to focus. She wouldn't be a match for the two of them. She had thought them prideful and headstrong, but instead they had planned their attack brilliantly. Mariko was a stronger fighter than the hunter she faced. Her ability to suppress her presence, combined with her own strength, made her too strong for him. The problem was, he knew it. No matter what attack she tried, he was more than willing to give up ground. Every step he retreated was one step further away from helping Ryu. Frustrated, Mariko attacked with renewed determination, her blade singing in the air. The hunter didn't even try to block her attacks. He just kept moving backwards and dodging. Even when Mariko reached out in a desperate attempt to strike him, he didn't seize the opportunity. Mariko paused her attacks for a moment, and the hunter let her. He didn't launch his own attack. It confirmed her suspicions. The hunter was in no rush to kill her. He planned on waiting for his partner to join him. Mariko's mind raced. Every moment she delayed was another moment Ryu was likely to die. She started walking backwards. She didn't dare turn her back to a hunter, but there was no reason for her to chase him. She could move back towards the hut, forcing the hunter into a decision. He could pursue, or he could wait. If he pursued and attacked, he risked exposing himself. But if he didn't, there was a chance Mariko would get back in time to the hut. The hunter made his decision without hesitation. He leapt forward to attack, but he couldn't sense how Mariko would defend. She waited until he was close, then stepped inside his guard and cut. He tried to react in time, but without being able to sense her, he was almost blind. Her blade opened his chest from shoulder to abdomen. It wasn't a fatal cut, but he was out of the fight for a while. Mariko turned and sprinted towards the hut. She hoped she wasn't too late. Not since he was a young boy had Ryu felt so helpless. He was 5 again, watching as his family and friends were killed all around him, unable to do anything to stop the massacre. If there were a pair of hunters out in the woods, he was worse than useless. He was an added danger to Mariko. He stationed himself near the door of the hut, a place of cover where the cuts of the hunter would be hampered. His heart froze when he heard the soft footsteps on the wooden steps. He thought back to his fight with Renzo, the technique he had tried to steal from Tenchi. Even though he couldn't use his sense, the technique should still work. He did his best to intend to strike in multiple places, confusing the sense of the hunter. When he stepped out from the doorway, he was surprised by how close the hunter was. The surprise broke his concentration, and the hunter blocked Ryu's cut with ease. Instinctively, Ryu threw himself towards the hunter. Whether through luck or overconfidence, the hunter was caught by surprise. Ryu tackled the hunter to the ground, dropping his own sword so he could get both his hands on the hunter's sword arm. They rolled on the ground, and with a sharp jerk, Ryu managed to disarm the hunter. He got a foot between his body and the hunter's and kicked him away from the swords. Ryu knew he was no match for the hunter, but if he could make the match a fist fight, perhaps he would have a chance. If nothing else, perhaps he would live long enough for Mariko to come rescue him. Ryu had trained in empty-handed combat, but his life had been focused on the sword. He only hoped the same was true of the hunter. As the hunter recovered his balance, he went to draw a knife at his side. Ryu charged him again, wrestling him to the ground and elbowing him in the face. They struggled against each other, but the hunter rolled and got on top of Ryu. The hunter lashed at Ryu with a flurry of punches, knees, and elbows that Ryu couldn't withstand. Ryu couldn't respond fast enough to block the ferocity of the attack and tried to curl into the fetal position. He got his arms up above his head, but the hunter kept his weight firmly on Ryu's hips, and he couldn't raise them. Ryu was being destroyed, the only good news being that punches alone wouldn't kill him instantly. But he wasn't sure how much longer he could last. The hunter rose up to land a devastating elbow, and Ryu seized the moment. He grabbed the clothes of the hunter and pulled him down, rotating his hips at the same time to get on top of the hunter. With a scream, he drove his fists furiously at any exposed part of the hunter he could. He lost all semblance of control, striking wildly. The hunter collected his wits and lifted his hips, throwing Ryu forward. Ryu tumbled, coming to his feet in time to see the hunter pick up his blade. Ryu's heart sank as he realized he had done all he could. He braced himself for the inevitable end. Mariko's sense told her that both the hunter and Ryu were still alive, but their presences were hard to separate. When she got within view of the hut, she understood why. The hunter and Ryu were rolling on the ground. Both of their blades were out of their hands, several paces away. They tumbled over each other, and for a moment Ryu was on top, face bloody, fists driving into the face of the hunter. The hunter raised his hips and threw Ryu forward, sprawling on the ground. The hunter scrambled away from Ryu, grabbing his blade and standing. Mariko saw the hint of a triumphant grin on his face. The hunter never knew Mariko had returned. He couldn't sense her, and all his attention was on Ryu. She stepped up behind him and slid her blade between his ribs and back out again, smooth and easy. Her blade went straight through his heart, as she intended. The hunter let out a surprised grunt and collapsed to the ground. Ryu saw a shadow, darker than the others, break out of the trees. Ryu could see it and knew it for Mariko, but the hunter had no idea his life was about to end. A blade pierced the hunter's heart, and he dropped to the ground, surprise still on his face. Ryu looked at Mariko. There weren't any cuts or blood on her, and he assumed she had killed the other hunter. He wondered again what had happened to her. Back on the island, he had sensed a change in her. All afternoon it had been on his mind. She had always been quiet, but her silence held a different quality than it once had. When he had last seen her, she had been strong, but not like this. Mariko studied him, and Ryu knew she was checking to see how badly he was injured. Without a word, she turned and melted back into the shadows of the trees. For a moment, Ryu feared she was leaving him, disgusted by his weakness. As he picked up his blade and cleaned the dirt off it, he realized what it was about Mariko that was different. She was stronger, yes, but more than that, she was focused, determined even. Ryu nodded to himself. That was it. She had purpose now. Mariko turned and went back into the woods. The first hunter, the one who had tried to draw her off, was coming towards her. She had to give him credit for his courage. With the cut on his chest, he didn't stand a chance, and with his partner dead, he knew it as well. The young hunter met his end well. He made one last cut, a fine one by any reckoning. But Mariko sensed it coming and stepped beside it. One smooth cut opened up the hunter's neck, and he fell to the ground, the last of his life fertilizing the soil. Chapter 9. Mariko declined to tell her story that evening, opting instead for rest. Ryu didn't sleep well that night, nervous about what the new day would bring. He had loved Mariko once. Perhaps he still did, but he wasn't sure she was the same person he had once known. They slept apart that night, and the chill in the air that Ryu felt seemed deeper than the winter's bite. When Ryu woke up the next morning, Mariko was already awake, moving through her morning practice. Ryu shook the sleep from his mind, amazed at the difference in her. When they had last been together, he had always been awake first. He watched her movement with interest, studying her technique. The speed of her practice was startling. Mariko had always been strong, but her cuts today were crisp and fast. She was faster and perhaps stronger than she had ever been before. He was not the only one who had learned much over the course of the past 6 moons. He knew his perspective was altered due to the lack of his sense, but she was definitely stronger. Last night she killed the 2 hunters with little difficulty. One thing was still true. Mariko was beautiful. She moved with speed, grace, and strength, and although Ryu had met many other Nightblades, none were as attractive to him as Mariko was. Not even Rei, in all her perfection. Mariko finished her practice and started heating water for tea. Ryu said nothing, watching her carefully. Even in her daily rituals, she was focused and completely present. He envied her. She was more alive than ever, and he was broken. When the tea was prepared, Ryu sipped at it gently. It was delicious, velvety richness blanketing his tongue. It was the best he had tasted in a long time, as long as he could remember. He thought back to Shigeru, who always claimed food and drink tasted better when consumed with dear company. Perhaps his surrogate father had been right about that too. Mariko began her story without prompting. She spoke of the long days wandering south, the abandoned emptiness of Azaria. Although her voice was steady, Ryu could tell those had been painful, fearful days for her. Ryu regretted his decision then. She had gone south alone, and he was not without blame. It had been her decision, and he wouldn't take that away from her, but it had been influenced in no small part by his desires. He had caused her suffering, and for that he felt ashamed. Mariko paused for the first time when she spoke of the one-armed hunter she had killed, and Ryu understood it was that decision that sparked this change he saw. She had broken her word and killed a man unawares. But as she spoke, Ryu thought it wasn't the killing that tormented her. It was the fact she felt so little guilt over it. She had survived. Ryu listened with rapt attention as she described the gathering. He was fascinated by the Azarians. His only experience with them had been in combat against the hunters, but Mariko had lived not just with their hunters, but with all their people. He laughed softly at her experiences at the tournament and her refusal to participate in the mounted archery portion. He tried to imagine her riding a horse while trying to hold a bow, and understood her refusal well. Ryu also paid attention to the tone Mariko spoke in. When she spoke of her time among the Azarians, of her hesitant friendship with Lobsang and Dorji, he noticed a hint of admiration and longing in her voice. She had gone south to learn more about the Azarians and to find who hunted them, but she had discovered a people whom she held in great respect. Ryu wondered at that. If there is one principle which guides them, it is the idea of strength. They are a hard people, and it is difficult not to think of the waste of life they create. But they are not cruel. They are disciplined and able to survive in a hard land. I think— Mariko hesitated, as though the thought itself would bring Ryu's anger upon her. I think that here in the Three Kingdoms we could learn something from them. So many here aren't able to defend themselves. When villages are attacked, people don't stand and fight. They run and die. Ryu was angered by her words, but he forced himself to study her. Mariko was a kind person, though her kindness was often shrouded by layers upon layers of silence. It sounded as though she was dangerously close to condoning the burning of villages, but the thought would never occur to her. He tried to understand. She was upset by the carnage the hunters created, and only wanted the people of the Three Kingdoms to be strong enough to fight back, to not die needlessly. He spoke softly. If the Azarians come, there will be a slaughter, won't there? She nodded. I believe so. It isn't because they are cruel or because they will view themselves as conquerors, but it will happen because they believe only the strong deserve to survive. It won't be overnight, but in a few moons many will die as the Azarians cull the weak. There are few in the three kingdoms strong enough to survive. Our lives have been too easy." Ryu turned the conversation to a subject more personal. He didn't want to think about the fate of the tens of thousands of people scattered throughout the kingdoms. "And what will you do?" Mariko answered him without hesitation. "I will survive." Ryu understood her now. Everything she had been through had stripped her of her other desires, her other dreams. She had become stronger in Azaria, but she had lost a part of herself. In her mind, survival was everything. But it wasn't, even if she didn't see it herself yet. If it was just an issue of survival, she would have left already. She wouldn't be roaming the woods, doing her best to protect the surrounding villages. He probed deeper. "You plan to leave?" She nodded again, and another silence descended as Ryu thought about the woman in front of him. "When will you go?" Now it was Mariko's turn to study him. "As soon as I am able." His final question was the most difficult to ask. "Will you stay here with me, at least for a while?" There was much more he would have said, but the words were too difficult to say. She stared at him in silence, and he worried he had presumed too much. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps survival was all that mattered to her. But then she answered, and his heart was filled with a cautious joy. "I will, for a while." Mariko and Ryu stood in a clearing facing each other, the same clearing they had been in so many moons ago when they were first attacked by the hunters. Prior to the attack, it had been one of Ryu's favorite places, but now the memories associated with the place made him wish he were anywhere else. It was why Mariko made them come here in the first place. He knew what she was trying to do, but his mind resisted. It had been 2 moons since they reunited, and Mariko killed the hunters. The height of winter had passed, and although spring was still far in the distance, the days were getting longer. In the time that had passed, they had tried to return to something resembling normalcy, but had failed. Ryu's weakness hung between them like a curtain, preventing them from adopting their old lifestyle. He tried to train, tried to recover his strength and his ability, but no effort of his own brought it back to him. Every time he drew his blade, he thought of all the lives that had been destroyed through his actions. Takako, Shigeru, Renzo, Rei, even Orochi. Their names and memories were a burden he wasn't sure he could shoulder. Mariko had tried training with him a couple of times, but it was apparent there was little she could do. Instead, they spent their time together talking. Ryu knew Mariko was listening closely to every word he spoke, and he knew she was trying to figure